Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station's Kyoto Vacation, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I'm Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here to kick back, relax, and talk about some anime this week on the show. A momentous episode as we begin part 2 of our Kyoto Vacation, where we're going to put away our tissues, we're going to dry our eyes, no more tears here, because we are welcoming a jollier season for the show. Because part 2 is called When Christmas Came to Otaku Town, on the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi and Lucky Star. For part 2, we are going to have 4 episodes. Today, we're going to be talking about season 1 of the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi. So all the stuff from 2006, we'll be covering it in the broadcast shuffle order. Next week, we'll be covering Lucky Star, the comedy anime basically made by the same team as the Haruhi people. Then we'll be doing Haruhi Season 2 in chronological order with the Season 1 episodes, and then wrapping up the week before Christmas with the greatest Christmas movie of all time, The Disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi. So this is a very momentous part for this podcast because this is something that I've been, wanting to rewatch the show Haruhi for a long time for myself, because I've only ever gone back and rewatched the movie. And then also I'm very excited to be able to watch the movie again around Christmas time. But yes, we are here to talk all things Haruhi today, Jonathan.
Indeed. Well, not all things Haruhi, because there's 2 more episodes of Haruhi we have to talk about. But we're talking all things season 1 of the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi. And it's a weird show. It is a weird fucking show. Yes, it is.
Especially when you watch it in the broadcast shuffle order.
The word weird, not a pejorative, just a statement of fact. Objectively, yes. Weird show.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's a weird show if you watched it in the chronological order. It's an extra weird show if you watched it in the broadcast shuffle order. Yeah, it is a very... Haruhi is a very, very strange series, like very intentionally so. Because the source material, which I haven't read much of, I read a little bit, like a couple chapters of the light novel just to see it. But the source material is weird. And then KyoAni took it and was like, you know what? We can make it weirder. And they just fucking ran with it. And yeah, it's a crazy show. I do really love it. I think it is not it is flawed in many ways, I think, particularly the show, more so than the movie. But it is also, I think, I find it kind of entrancing because it is so peculiar. It's so odd. There's nothing like it. There have been shows that tried to imitate Haruhi in the years since, but nothing has really kind of replicated what this show is, either in terms of genre, style, or like aesthetic and kind of like narrative execution. And it is just like, it's you go on a journey across this show in many ways. So yeah, I'm very curious. I have no idea how you feel. We have not talked about the show at all off the air, so I have no idea what your impressions are, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. I think it's really, really interesting. I think I have maybe some quibbles here and there, but honestly, I think they're very minor. And I want to stress, I had 0 experience with this show. Yes. I had wanted to see it for a very long time, and I had just been putting it off because I knew we were going to do a podcast eventually. So I just stayed away from it. I stayed unspoiled. I didn't know anything about it. I couldn't have told you what an enclosed space is. I couldn't have told you... I knew the term SOS Brigade. I knew the name of the main character, Kyon and Haruhi. I didn't know what the SOS Brigade stood for. I didn't know Haruhi was a god. I didn't know any of that. And we watched it, Sean's going to expand on this, but we watched it in the original broadcast shuffle order, which if you are not on the ground in Japan in 2006, you have to kind of recreate for yourself. And I found it extremely interesting. I think there was maybe the first half or so of the show, I found it intellectually interesting, but it wasn't really hitting me. And then you get to my favorite episode of the show by far. One of my favorite things we've watched this season, which is the one that is technically the series finale. It just comes in the middle of the season. Episode 28 in the overall run, the Someday in the Rain. Yes. And I think that one is a masterpiece, and we'll talk about it later. I think it is a formalist, avant-garde, super phenomenal piece of animation and just of filmmaking. And we'll talk about that later. And I think from that point in, I was pretty locked in. And I think the closing run is perfect. I can't imagine watching this in chronological order, and part of that is because I watched it this way. But if you do, it's extraordinarily obvious that it was meant to be watched this way. Mm-hmm. And it's super interesting. I think it is really playing with and defamiliarizing a bunch of anime tropes and genre elements And it's like full on experimental in a bunch of ways and has given me ideas. And I might have a little bit on it in my dissertation because I think there's something that connected to something else that it's like the weirdness of this show and the way you kind of, as viewers of it today, have to reconstruct the order of it after the fact. All of that is like super fascinating to me. And I think it's a very like rich vein of stuff to talk about.
Yeah, it's fascinating because this is the first time I've committed to the broadcast order. When I originally watched it, I watched about halfway through it. I can tell you the exact jumping off point because this is what I vaguely remembered. And then on rewatching the show, I'm like, yes, this is what happened. Where I watched it up to the point where you get part 1 of the murder mystery. And then it ends with a huge cliffhanger, and then the next episode is totally unrelated.
Yep.
And I just was like, "What the fuck is happening?" And at that time, I had no context at all. That I didn't know there was a thing called the broadcast order. I didn't know when I originally watched the show that there was some sort of like other order of watching it or anything like that. I had even less context than you did, Jonathan. So because it was also the way I watched it, it was just in the broadcast order. Like it was just that I didn't even know. I think there was a season 2 when I originally watched it.
You were probably having to like pirate it and download it, and
yes.
It's just the order it came in, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it was just a show that I had heard a lot about, and people said it was really popular. This was when I was just watching every anime I could get my hands on in like 2013, 2014. And so I watched. This has been, I think, before I started studying Japanese. And so I just grabbed a torrent online I found. I started watching it. Was very confused by the first episode. Then it was like, okay, I can see what the show is now in the second episode, and kind of got into it. And then that split just made my head hurt when they did that cut at the end of that part 1. And so then I looked up and saw all that and got some erroneous information online in the English community, because there's a thing that the English community says, which if you think about it for 2 seconds, doesn't actually make any sense if you know anything about anime production schedules, but that the show was not meant to be broadcast in that order, that it was supposed to be chronological order, but in the vein of something like a Firefly. I think this is why people said this, is that there are American network shows that have been broadcast out of chronological order by the studios in a way that was not designed by the creators of the show. People talked about Haruhi in that way. That's wrong. But I thought that I kind of accepted what people said online, and so then I rewatched it in chronological order. And I think it will be fascinating when we do the season 2 stuff and you watch in chronological order. And I think seeing Someday in the Rain in its context as a last episode is fascinating, because I love it as a finale as much, if not more, than I love it in the middle. But yeah, it's a very bizarre thing, the kind of episode order stuff. So this is the first time I committed to the broadcast order, and I do think it is, especially if you're wanting to watch the season 1 material without the season 2 material, you want to separate those out, you got to do it as the broadcast order. I think it's valid probably to just do, fuck it, I just want to watch it easy, just go the chronological order with all the season 2 stuff in there. But there is something lost by the fact that the broadcast order is not easily accessible in just you can buy a thing and just watch it that way. There are older Blu-rays, and like the original, some of the original English releases had the broadcast order on there, but all the modern releases don't. They just have it in normal season 2 chronological with everything kind of mixed in. So yeah, I'm very glad. I had sort of gone back and forth multiple times when we were planning this episode, what we would do with Haruhi. Would we do the broadcast order? Would we not do the broadcast order? How do you handle season 2? I'm very happy with what we're doing and how we're being more thorough about it and really kind of spending the time going through all this stuff, because yes, this is a crazy weird show, and it is very much designed to be weird in this, or watched in this crazy weird way.
Yeah, and I just, another word on the broadcast order thing, like I can, I guess, understand the other perspective, but it's just, I think especially when you're coming to it clean, it was designed to be watched, like, episode 6 is a season finale. There's just no, like, the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi part 6 is, like, literally structured like an anime season finale. It would be ridiculous to say KyoAni intended that to be the 6th episode you watch. It's not. And, like, I think a lot of the episodes that would be placed later, I think, would be a lot less rich without the specific context they're put in here. So we'll have this whole conversation later, but I will thump the Bible for the broadcast order because, as you say, Sean, there's several things. One, when studios do tinker, they don't tinker to make it weird and experimental. That's not like a thing that, like, they didn't change Firefly around because they wanted to have like a cool avant-garde experiment with the structure of storytelling in a televised medium. That's not what studios do. Two, that's not how production schedules work. You don't just have all the episodes done months ahead of time. And three, watch the episodes. It's clear.
Yes. Well, especially if you know going in. Like, that's the one thing, like, and luckily you have to know going in these days, because that's the one thing that makes it easy. Like, if you have absolutely no idea, like, it is so disorienting when particularly that part 1, part 2 thing is just, like, that's the only one that is a, like, fuck you to episode break.
But it's
more
great.
than a, like, yeah, it's great, but you got to know that it's coming more than just, like, what is happening? But it's fascinating show. I've got a lot of notes because there's a lot that goes into this. And the thing I want to start with is it's finally time, Jonathan, to just do it. We got to have the Moe talk because we are now fully in it. Like, we were really in it in many ways with the key shows, but once we were in with Haruhi and then Lucky Star next week, and then after that we'll be starting moving to stuff like K-On! Eventually. We got to start, like, just really talking about Moe, especially because Haruhi, now you know, Jonathan, you've watched it, like, they say the word Moe at least, like, once an episode. It is integrated, like, fundamentally into the texture of the show itself, so it's a thing that I want to make sure we have, like, the proper context for what this term means, because it is a very weird term that obviously can't really be translated into English, and it's very fundamental to so much of what modern anime is, and especially a lot of the stuff that Kyoani is making around this time. So let's have the Moe talk.
My only disappointment is that we're not having the Moe talk on the episodes that you have dubbed Moe Money, Moe Problems, which is like part 3 or 4 of this season. But I think we can have it now. That's fine.
Well, I want to have it now so we already know all the Moe stuff before we get to KO. And that's part of the point as well.
Before we start having Moe Money and Moe Problems.
Yeah, so here's the Moe talk. This is my mini essay on Moe. So as we move into the next phase of Kyoto Vacation, we have to talk about Moe as a phenomenon in otaku culture because it's essential to unraveling the cultural context for all these shows we're covering, Haruhi, Lucky Star, K-On!, all that stuff. So Moe is a very complex term that has a lot of different meanings, and those meanings and usages have evolved and shifted over the years, but it is no understatement to assert that Moe is one of the most essential concepts at the heart of the shift in the anime and otaku industry that it underwent in the mid-90s into the early 2000s. Moe is the heart that beats at the rise of many popular modern genres, such as slice of life and its many variants, the harem romance genre, the visual novel stuff we all looked at in the last part. All that is fueled by the engine of Moe. And the rise, and then the hyper-commercialization of otaku markets, Vocaloids, gacha games, VTubers, like the list is endless. If you're looking at the modern world of the otaku media landscape, Moe is like fundamentally the thing that makes it work. So what is it? Here's my piece on the etymology and usage. This took a long time to try to research. Where does this word come from? And the reason it takes a long time to research is because it's like nobody fucking knows. It's a piece of slang. So as a piece of slang developed within otaku communities in the late 80s and the early 90s, and the exact origins of the term are impossible to determine. Whether you're trying to research this in English or in Japanese, there's no, like, here is where this word originally came from. The word was likely spread in early online otaku communities on BBS forums, and that's one of the reasons why its origin is kind of lost, is because those forums aren't saved anywhere, right? So, like, those are lost to time. The word itself is written with the kanji moeru, which is a kanji which means to sprout, but it is homophonic with another kanji, moeru, which means to burn. And the usage is probably connected to this homophone of, like, to sprout means like to bud, like a budding flower, and to burn can be like to physically burn something, but also to, like, burn with passion or love. So you kind of conflate these two meanings, this kind of innocent wanting something to nurture and see it grow, while also feeling kind of this burning passion. And whether that pun was originally intended in how it was originally written, I don't know, but it is how the word is used today, so it's embedded in its common usage. The word moe expresses, here's my tip to the definition, expresses a narrow but deep affection towards the target of affection, as opposed to the broad but shallow affection expressed by the more general term ski, right? So this is like the functionality of the term in an otaku community, is you can say that you like a character, like Haruhi no koto ga suki, I like Haruhi, But that just expresses sort of a general, I like this thing. Moe expresses like, I have like a very narrow, very specific, but incredibly deep affection for this specific character or whatever. And so you'd use the word moe to express that level of affection. The target of moe must be something that cannot return that affection. That's essential to the usage of the word. So it must be like a fictional character. It could be a celebrity or like a pop idol. So if you have a celebrity crush, like that could be expressed in the terms of moe. You can potentially use this term. This is usually in a more jokey fashion, but you can use it for an inanimate object. Like if you have a car that has looks like it has a cute face on the front with the grill and the headlights or something, looks like a smiley face. Like you could use the word moe for that, but you're not going to use the word moe for your girlfriend because that would be creepy and weird. While the term moe is often thought to express a form of romantic or sexual affection, I argue that that's not really the case. Romantic or sexual attraction may be felt towards the thing, but that is on top of moe. Moe itself is more nuanced and more specific. And then I found a quote here that I love, that this is to me the best poetic description of moe. So considering the root kanji, moe expresses a sense of care and nurturing for the object of affection, the 1999 book Kuso Bishoujo Daihyakkya Den no Moe Moe Bishoujo Daishugo, or The Imaginal Beautiful Girl Encyclopedia, Digital Moe Moe Beautiful Girl Assembly. Both titles are great, whether it's in English or Japanese. They put it best as, it's the feeling of feeling springtime in your heart. So when you feel moe for something, it's when you feel springtime in your heart for that character or that concept.
That sounds like what I feel for my dog.
Yes.
Yes, which makes sense. A lot of moe girls have some kind of animal connection too, so
yes.
Makes sense.
Exactly. So that's for me the best I can do for the etymology and definition. And again, moe is a very sort of particular term. Hopefully, if people aren't entirely sure what it means, that gives you some clarity. But I also want to talk about the history, because the history here I think is fascinating, and it's important to talking about, especially in the context of Haruhi, where Haruhi is a kind of shifting point into the modern world of anime. I think it's seeing how this kind of builds up is important. So while the term didn't exist in the early 80s, much of what we can consider the roots of moe anime started in the early 80s in anime, right? So you're kind of your post-70s Gundam, mecha, that kind of era, and you're into that sort of the early rise of the proper hobbyist era of anime. That's where this really comes from. The rise of the Maho Shoujo, or the magical girl genre, saw the introduction of two key series connected to the moe phenomenon, Magical Princess Minky Momo and Magical Angel Creamy Mami. That's Mami, M-A-M-I, just to be clear, because if you say Creamy Mami in English, it sounds really dirty. It's just a given name for a character. She's not your mommy. She's not your Creamy Mami. Don't be weird about it. Both of these series, while primarily targeted at girls, gained a male audience as well, right? So you have these sort of very feminine-focused series targeted at young girls, but you start getting this male audience that starts watching these shows. So that shift in demographics, where male audience begins showing interest and dedication to traditionally feminine shows that have a cute or girlish aesthetic, is foundational to the development of moe. So a parallel people might be more familiar with in Western animation would be My Little Pony. My Little Pony is absolutely a moe show, just in Western animation, or Powerpuff Girls would have been that for when we were kids. The 80s saw the beginnings of the Bishoujo characters and that kind of visual style and archetype in anime, beautiful girl characters, and the solidification of otaku culture. And with the rise of home media, a more dedicated, individualized market existed to be catered to, and this included things like our OVAs, which all kind of started in the 80s. So all of those factors set the roots for a market that could effectively fetishize these Bishoujo characters and create the cultural conditions around which the concept of moe is formed. By the early 90s, moe as a term was developed and spread around otaku communities, but the term was unknown to anyone outside that sphere. Sailor Moon, like Minky Momo, developed a dedicated adult male fanbase, enough so that one of the theories of the root for moe comes from the Sailor Saturn character Hotaru Tomoe, because that moe is written with the same kanji, but there's a lot of evidence that the moe that term pre-exists the character, so that's almost certainly wrong. In the late 80s, early 90s, moe was a purely subjective term, meaning that it was a term developed by the audience to describe their subjective feelings towards specific stories and characters. However, by the mid-90s, saw the beginnings of a new facet to moe, which is moe as an objective concept, meaning a concept embedded in the broader culture that creators, not just audience members, were aware of and integrated into their worldview and into their art. This shift begins the creation of what we now consider moe anime. And at the heart of this shift is, of course, Studio Gainax, a studio of otaku, by otaku, and for the otaku. Studio Gainax intentionally incorporated self-aware otaku concepts like moe and the tsundere character archetype into their projects, which exploded in 1995 with Neon Genesis Evangelion. EVA has had a wide number of significant impacts on the industry, but the greatest by far was the commercialization of their moe characters Asuka and Rei. Asuka the tsundere and Rei the kudere characters became iconic in Japanese pop culture, and they were merchandised to absolute hell. Asuka and Rei were plastered and sold on everything anyone can imagine: figurines, wall scrolls, posters, acrylic stands, folders, pin badges, games, cards, clothes, towels, cars, credit cards, toothbrushes, electric razors, furniture, books, underwear, fishing lures, engagement rings, you name it, they put Asuka and Rei on it. The absurd success of this hyper-aggressive merchandising strategy demonstrated the potential of moe as a market force, and so the late 90s and early 2000s saw the introduction of the first anime that were fundamentally created to be moe anime. By the early 2000s, moe had grown to be a common term, understood by the majority of Japanese people, and you will hear moe brought up in reference by mainstream figures on mainstream TV in Japan, the equivalent of like Stephen Colbert making a moe joke on late-night TV. In 2005, the Hamagine Research Institute determined that moe anime games and manga represented a market value of 88.8 trillion yen, or roughly $600 million in today's conversion rate, and by 2009, over half of all late-night anime were moe anime. Ultimately, in the modern anime industry, moe is an essential element to how many characters are designed, written, performed, marketed, and merchandised. Characters are designed with moe elements that fit in moe archetypes to attract an audience that is looking to feel moe. And while Haruhi is not purely a moe anime, we'll see that with Lucky Star and K-On!, it is fundamental to how the three main heroines, Haruhi, Yuki, and Mikuru, were created. That is my moe talk.
That is a good moe talk. Here's my question. So yes. I understand the concept of moe as you're explaining it here. And it's the kind of thing where, like, you hear someone explain it like you're explaining it, Sean, and it's just like, oh, yeah, it's that thing, right? You kind of know it when you see it. But, like, it feels to me more like an element within shows than, like, I guess I'm wondering, how do you define what is, like, and how did these researchers, I'm almost wondering, like, define a moe anime specifically versus, like, it's a piece that's in a lot of anime. I mean, you can go back and say, the Gundam Double Zeta has a lot of moe shit in it. You wouldn't call it a moe anime, it's still a mecha anime. So I'm curious, like, where those lines you might think are.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the thing of that stat I had, by 2009, over half of all late-night anime were moe anime, I'm imagining they probably used a fairly broad definition. So I would imagine they were probably counting Haruhi as a moe anime because of the nature of the three main girls. I wouldn't really call Haruhi a moe anime because I think that that's so broad that then, like, once you're saying that over half of all late-night anime are moe anime, it's no longer useful as a genre. That's more like these are moe characters or animes that use moe archetypes, but that's so common that that's like not enough to call it a genre. I think that question will be a lot easier to answer when we watch K-On!, because K-On! To me is like, this is what an actual moe anime is, where moe is so fundamental to the, like, engine that drives the fundamental show that, like, it cannot be extracted, right? Like, you can imagine Suzumiya Haruhi, a version of the story that sort of, like, downplays some of that tsundere stuff with Haruhi, the kudere stuff with Yuki, and all the stuff with Mikuru, right? And you can kind of, like, sand those elements out a fair amount, and, like, the fundamental story is still there. You still have the characters, you still have, like, all the experimental filmmaking stuff, all that remains. Moe is not essential to what Haruhi is. I think Moe is essential to K-On! And to a lesser extent Lucky Star. I think you'll see it there as well, where those shows have much less plot, they have less character development, and it's more about trying to trigger fundamentally that feeling of affection for the characters and this feeling of being kind of soothed by enjoying cute girls doing cute things. That to me is, like, fundamentally what an actual moe show is, were I to define it.
And I also wonder, I guess there's also a difference between, like, in Haruhi is not the main character. Kyon is our main character. He's our point of view. To my knowledge, in Lucky Star and K-On!, it's the girls on the cover are your point of view of everything. And that is a little different as well.
Yes, and then you get some shows where it's like they exist in a world seemingly where men don't exist, to so fully capitalize on we want cute girls doing cute things that's like we just kind of ignore the existence of men. I think there are male characters in K-On!, but none of them are major. I don't think it's like there are no boys in the school, but
there are definitely boys in the school in K-On! Because I've already edited the theme song for this season, which has K-On! Footage, and there's boys in the classrooms. So there's that. But yeah, there's no boys in the band.
Yes, but there are definitely shows that, like, even though they won't be explicitly set at an all-girls school, just like there for whatever reason there just aren't any boys here. That is like the most "this is a moe show" thing possible, is if you existed a randomly no men are here, not for a narrative reason, but because that's what the show is.
I do like the idea of there being just a whole genre of shows that are about some kind of crazy Children of Men-esque future where like one genre has died out, but everything is like, unlike some, it's not apocalyptic. It's just all fun and normal and everyone's moe.
Exactly. It's a good time.
All right. So we've had the moe talk, Sean. I think we're all good.
So hopefully that gives people the historical context to appreciate what's going on here. So then let's talk about the history of Suzumiya Haruhi itself. So Suzumiya Haruhi originally comes from a series of light novels. They come from the novel anthology magazine called The Sneaker, which is a magazine published by Kadokawa, although I don't think the magazine's around anymore. But it was in the early 2000s. And so the June 2003 issue of The Sneaker featured the light novel, The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi. This was the debut novel of the writer Tanigawa Nagaru. It had illustrations and character design by the artist Ito Noisy, who's like the artist that does all the character designs. Obviously, Kyoto did their takes on them, but the fundamental character designs are Ito Noisy. The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi arrived immediately to great acclaim and success, so the light novels were popular before the anime was a thing. The first volume won the 8th Sneaker Grand Prize, which is an event hosted by the magazine itself that ran the series, basically picking what was like the best thing we ran this year. It was also the top rated light novel in the poll run in the first ever This Light Novel is Amazing guidebook, which is crazy. If you know anything about light novels, you know that's a pretty, like, within the world of light novels, a fairly like prestigious publication that runs a bunch of fan polls and stuff. And all the other like big things that have won this prize are series like Spice and Wolf, Full Metal Panic, Certain Magical Index, Sword Art Online. So if you Overlord, I think, has, like, if you know a popular light novel series and one that people really love, chances are it has won that top prize in This Light Novel is Amazing. And the first one ever was Suzumiya Haruhi, and that's kind of cool. And Suzumiya Haruhi would continue to rank highly in the poll in following years, though typically you don't ever have a series win the top prize for multiple volumes, because I think that'd be kind of boring. The success and popularity of The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi gave birth to a series of ultimately 12 light novels, though it's possible that Tanigawa may make more, because the last one was published in 2020 after a 9-year hiatus. There's basically like a kind of anniversary thing for the magazine, where they brought back a special version of the magazine and did some runs of new shows that the magazine, The Sneaker, used to do, and that was the last light novel published. The light novels followed a pattern of generally alternating between single-story novels, so like The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi novel is just one big story. That's why it's a 6-part episode thing in the anime. But then also you would have novels that contain 3 to 4 short stories, and some of those short stories are told out of chronological order. So all the episodes that are kind of one-offs, those are all adaptations of different short stories from some of the other volumes. The Suzumiya Haruhi series is generally considered to be one of the best and most successful light novel series ever. A limited edition set that contained the last 2 volumes pre-hiatus, The Surprise of Suzumiya Haruhi Parts 1 and 2, was published on May 25th, 2011, and it sold 500,000 copies and set the record for the fastest-selling first edition of a light novel ever. I think a record that is still unbroken. At that point, the light novels had sold in total 8 million copies in Japan, and by 2017, the series has sold globally over 20 million copies. That 20 million copies novel or number is very impressive when you put it into even more context. So they hit that number of 20 million when there were only 11 volumes of Suzumiya Haruhi. That's about a 1.8 million average per volume. The only light novel series to sell more than Haruhi are Sword Art Online and A Certain Magical Index. Sword Art Online has sold about 30 million copies, but has 27 volumes, so over 2 times the number of volumes. That's about a 1.1 million average. Obviously, like, some of those volumes are spin-offs and will sell more than others, but the point being, you got a lot more product.
Does that count all the, like, progressive volumes and, like...
I believe so.
Then you're closer to, like, 40 volumes, actually.
Oh, okay, yeah.
27 plus progressive is another 8. And then there's a few others. There's a lot.
Yeah, so I'll have to check those numbers again on what 30 million was counting, because I think I just went off of what the site I said had, that they like celebrated some anniversary and said, hey, we've sold over 30 million copies. Then I just went on Wikipedia to look at the number of copies. So you might be right. That might actually even be lower in terms of the average. The other series that has sold more than Haruhi is Certain Magical Index, also around 30 million copies. That also this one is definitely including spin-offs, is 46 volumes total, and that's about a 652,000 average. And so Haruhi, while like is not the highest selling light novel series just by raw numbers, put into its relative context, it's by far the best selling one, because most light novel series that are popular go way more than 11 volumes. So yeah, the series sold very well. And again, that popularity started before the anime. Obviously, the anime being insanely popular just like boosted the sales even more. So that's the context for the light novel. Let's talk about how KyoAni adapted it. I'll say up front, you know that Haruhi is a show that people fucking love because in Japanese, on Japanese Wikipedia, I have not yet encountered a show that was adapted from source material that had its own Wikipedia page about the adaptations. Like everything is like, if you want to read the anime Wikipedia page for Haruhi, you would have to go to the Haruhi light novel series and scroll down to find the anime section. Not the case for Haruhi. They're like, no, there's too much shit about this. It's got to have its own page. So people like Haruhi and wrote a lot about Haruhi. So for the KyoAni adaptation, first a little point on kind of the perspective of the series and how it's marketed. So the editor-in-chief of the sneaker magazine, Nozaki Takehiko, decided to use Noisy Ito's art as the main focus in how they promoted the series, and in particular chose to use Haruhi herself as the main focus in promoting the franchise, right? Instead of picking Kyon, which is a smart choice because, he's the main character, but he's Kyon. The concept became as if Haruhi herself was producing and promoting the series, and that became the framework through which the franchise was merchandised. So almost like a meta thing, that like Haruhi's promoting her own show. Kadokawa publicity manager Nishiyama Yosuke described it as, quote, if there's one thing both the novels and the marketing share, it's that they are dominated by Haruhi, and that they tried to do things that Haruhi would find interesting. This philosophy translated to Ito Atsushi, who was the producer at Kadokawa in charge of the Haruhi anime project. This is how detailed the Wikipedia page is in Japanese, that they tell you the exact place that the first planning meeting for the anime took place at. The meeting for the anime planning committee happened for Haruhi at Lake Biwako, which is probably a very beautiful place. And at the meeting were director Ishihara Tatsuya, the asshole Yamamoto Yutaka, the original author Tanigawa Nagaru, composer Kosaki Satoru, and art director Tamura Seiki. At first, Ishihara, after reading the novels, felt that they were interesting as literature, but he was concerned that they wouldn't be well-suited to being adapted to anime, which Tanigawa, the light novel author, agreed with. Yamamoto argued that the series could work by centering it around Kyon's monologues and keeping it within his perspective. Ishihara wanted to make sure that the series didn't become, quote, just another moe show, and Tanigawa requested that they fill the series with the sort of expressions and playfulness that only anime could do. It was at this meeting. Oh, yeah.
I just think that's interesting that was Ishihara's like first instinct with this is that, man, I don't know if this is going to work, because I thought about that a lot watching it of, this is an interesting challenge because this is and I looked at the light novels too, just to check. I'm like, it's talky. Like there's a lot of dialogue. It's kind of funny. I watched the first couple episodes of the anime the same day we were teaching in my film class, His Girl Friday, which is famously like the talkiest American movie ever made. And it is like, Haruhi is very screwball in that way. It's machine gun dialogue at you.
Yes.
And like Kyon's narrative, internal monologues are really long. And in a lot of anime or movies based on a book that is that talky, you would cut down that dialogue a lot more than they do. And instead, KyoAni leans into it and like really makes, it's another part of what I think this show is sort of formalist and experimental, is that there's long stretches that are talking over really mundane imagery and it's kind of durational. And that very much seems like that was Yamamoto's instinct at that meeting. And that makes sense to me. I just think that's interesting that they were thinking about that from day one, because you can feel it in the show.
Yes, it absolutely is like one of the fundamental tensions in the show is like, how do you make this material interesting to in a visual medium? Because I also like that the light novel author himself was like, yeah, you're right. Like it doesn't really make sense to make an anime out of it, but it's really popular. It seems to be like Tanigawa Nagaru, the author, seems to be like a guy who has just a really good sense of humor. It's just, we'll get into it. So this meeting is also part of where a lot of this chronology stuff happens in terms of the shuffle order. So before the meeting at Lake Biwako, the author Tanigawa mentioned that they didn't necessarily have to do it in chronological order. So I think this is very interesting, that the kernel of the idea came from the original light novel author, that you don't have to do it chronologically. Yamamoto wanted the end of the Melancholy book to be the end of the series, and Ishihara wanted to do the whole Melancholy arc after doing various side stories. So Ishihara's original idea was, let's do a bunch of the side stuff first, and then you go back and find out how you got here. Then Yamamoto was the one who's like, oh, well, let's at least make like the end of Melancholy the end of the show. Ultimately, Tanigawa was the one who said, why don't you just take this opportunity to totally ignore the order? So he's just like, hey, just take the idea of chronological order, just fucking throw it out the window. In an interview for Otana Anime, or Adult Anime, which is what that translates to, before the season aired, Ishihara explained the reasoning behind the shuffle broadcast. And to be clear, that's how they refer to it, is shuffle order, is what like they called it in Japanese. He described it as a way to be both loyal to the source material and have surprises for fans of that source material. They were concerned that a straight adaptation would be boring for people who read the novel, probably because of some of that talky stuff, but they didn't want to insert a lot of anime original material. Additionally, by inserting the short stories in between the Melancholy episodes, they could plant pieces of foreshadowing to connect everything together. The concept of the anime became that it was actually directed by Suzumiya Haruhi herself, who was the super director. And Suzumiya Haruhi has the super director credit at the beginning of every opening theme and then at the end of all the ending themes. So she is top billed super director Suzumiya Haruhi. Yamamoto came up with the idea to start with episode 0, Asahina Mikuru's adventure, because it opened with an episode literally directed by Haruhi to satisfy her own ego. While the main director usually directed the first episode of a series, Yamamoto directed and storyboarded episode 0 because to follow through on that idea, and then Ishihara directs the kind of like real first episode about Melancholy Part 1. Ishihara said that the foundations of the scripts was that the drama never progressed anywhere that Kyon wasn't. And one focus for Ishihara in the production was to make the anime feel real. That's my translation of the Japanese word namapoi. And so to that end, they didn't use cartoonist signifiers on characters like exaggerated sweating, big anger marks on the foreheads, like those kind of super stylized anime things. They're not really in the show. Instead, they use experimental techniques, but it's more experimental techniques from the world of film, like weird lenses and stuff like that. Not so much here's a big crazy cartoon face all the time.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. And I think it also, like, again, talking about the shuffle broadcast order and everything, it's you can tell how intentional it is. And we'll talk about it with episode 0. Like, that episode is so specific with how it introduces you to the characters through this weird movie that they've made. And like, I just think if you look at the first time Haruhi appears on screen in the Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, if you watch it in this order, is extremely intentional in a way that you wouldn't do if you were really making it later in the show.
Yes, it is the weirdest thing about when we will see that episode in chronological order is the ending of that episode feels like bizarre when it's taken out of the context of being episode 1. So that's the history of how it was made. But we really need to talk about the popularity of this show, because more than anything we've talked about so far with KyoAni, Haruhi was a hit, like a huge, massive, kind of industry-defining hit. So the anime critic Fujitsu Yota has described Haruhi as the series that began the modern age of anime, and in many ways I really agree with his assessment. I think this is the point where you see this shift of where anime in the early 21st century, like the early 2000s, was really trying to figure out what fucking business model, like how do we work, right? After the bubble burst at the end of the 80s, and anime was kind of like wayward in the 90s, and you had the late night anime market, but it wasn't super successful. You had Eva, which was crazy popular, but nothing could really replicate that popularity. Is like anime was trying to kind of find its footing as the business reality of the market changed. And Haruhi fundamentally is, I think, the show that kind of nailed, this is how you can make a show like this popular. It sort of like hailed the sort of rise of and dominance of the late night anime industry. And sort of like forged the path that shows even like as recently as Oshinoko and Bocchi the Rock, in particular Bocchi the Rock, have followed the same strategies that Haruhi used to get really successful. So at the time, Haruhi was not expected to be a massive hit as an anime. The show was broadcast on UHF networks, which reached a far narrower market. It aired in only a late night time slot, so it was like past midnight is when it originally aired. It only had one core, which was not super common at the time, right? This is still where you're still having lots of shows with 52 episode runs in 2006. And it's an adaptation of a light novel, which in 2006 was relatively rare, and most of them weren't super popular, the anime adaptations. So at the time, all of those conditions indicated a project which would only hit a very narrow and very niche market. However, by 2006, one big thing has changed, which is the early form of the modern internet was emerging. So you have new social media platforms, you have easier access to pirated copies online, and also you have video sites like Nico Nico Doga, particularly in Japan, and then YouTube around the world were picking up traction. So this allowed Haruhi to be in some ways the first anime that became viral in a modern sense. KyoAni courted this market through several key elements. One was the promotional website for the show, which is haruhi.tv, which that website is still up, and it's still like, at least like most of it is pretty still similar to how it originally was. The website was designed like the SOS homepage in the show, as though the characters themselves had made it and became a way of courting the internet community, right? So it's kind of that like self-referential meta kind of construction to the promotion. Additionally, you have the Hare Hare Yukai dance in the ending theme, which that became immediately viral with Odotte Mita, or I Tried to Dance videos on Nico Nico Doga, basically doing dance covers of the dance. And then it became a meme where you had flash dance mobs at otaku conventions in Japan and internationally, which was a tradition well into the like early 2010s. So this would be like someone would just start playing the Hare Hare Yukai song, and then all the cosplayers at the convention would just start doing the dance, that kind of thing. The virality of Haruhi Online also created a gateway through which the series could gain traction overseas as well. Haruhi was an early series to capitalize on the trend of live performance of anime using the voice actors. So Hirono Aya, Minoru Chihara, and Gotuza, or Goto Yuko, all performed Hare Hare Yukai at the second ever Animelo Summer Live Festival, which Animelo is a super popular summer concert that's held every summer. It has been since 2005 for anime songs. It's like a really huge event. The last one was just a couple weeks ago from us recording this. And that the second ever Animelo, they were there in character as special guests, which was not a thing that they had done for the first concert. It was all kind of classic anime songs, and this was, the show had just aired, the voice actors are there, they're doing the dance, and they're singing the song basically in character. On March 18th, 2007, a live performance/concert called Suzumiya Haruhi no Gekiso was held. The first section of the performance involved the cast reflecting on their favorite scenes from the anime, to which, to my delight, Tomokazu Sugita, the voice actor of Shikkyon, showed up dressed as Char from Gundam. I don't know why, he just did. Then he performed an original skit, and with lots of improv, and there were lots of Gundam references there as well between him and Ono Daisuke, because they're both big Gundam fans. And then the second part was a 2-hour live concert featuring music from the show and the character CDs. And so this was like a huge live event. This is not necessarily like the first live event ever for an anime that did this, but like on the scale like this, and for a show that had only done 14 episodes, that was like a weird late night anime that with 14 episodes and all this shit. Like, this is so incredible in terms of like how popular it was and the amount of production they could put into it. The Haruhi series would have other similar live events in 2009, 2012, and 2016. The sociologist Miyairi Kyohei described Haruhi as a pioneer in combining anime and live performance culture, serving as a precursor to the idol anime boom of the late 2000s, early 2010s, with stuff like Idol Master and Love Life School Idol Project, and we're still in that boom today, I would argue. The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi helped popularize the pilgrimage phenomenon, whereby fans of an anime visit the real-world locations used in the production, either as literal named locations or as reference material. Haruhi was not necessarily the first anime to experience this, but the term Seichi Junrei in Japanese, which means like pilgrimage of sacred sites, that basically comes from the Haruhi fan community using that term for what they were doing, and it kind of became like an established phenomena post-Haruhi. This is an incredible one. Doujinshi, or fan-made manga of Haruhi, were so popular in 2006 that doujinshi groups regularly held Haruhi-only doujinshi sales booths in Akihabara every few weeks. These were so successful that eventually they started separating these out by character, and they would have Haruhi, Yuki, and Mikuru exclusive booths. So that's how popular the doujinshi were, is that they had to break it up by fucking characters. The viral success of Haruhi Online meant that the series became popular with anime circles internationally. Hirono Aya, Minoru Chihara, and Yuko Goto, or Gotuza, as I know her, were invited as guests to the 2007 Anime Expo in LA, which is like fucking crazy. That's just like, because that show did not officially come out in English at that point, to be fucking clear, and still there were guests there. The DVDs were massively successful. The average volume sold about 40,000 copies, and all told, season 1 sold about 500,000 DVDs, which is a scale of success like over twice as much as anything we've talked about so far that KyoAni had released. In 2009, when the OP for season 2 Super Driver was being sold, it was announced that Haruhi CDs had sold over 1 million copies. There were 9 character song CDs released for season 1. There were 7 additional made for season 2. Hirono Aya, Minoru Chihara, and Gotuza hosted the SOS Brigade radio Radio Club, a promotional radio show which aired 48 episodes from February to December 2006. There are 5 different Haruhi games which were released on PSP, PS2, Wii, and DS, with multiple other games released for smart devices. There are 2 different Haruhi pachinko machines, 4 drama CDs, 3 manga adaptations, and countless spin-offs, most notably The Disappearance of Nagato Yuki-chan, the manga, which also received the anime adaptation in 2015. So needless to say, Haruhi was really fucking popular.
Holy shit. Yeah, I actually didn't know it was this popular. I knew it was popular. Yeah. I knew it was obviously extremely beloved. But, you know, in the back of my head, I guess I had been wondering, how did KyoAni get away with making a fully 3-hour movie based on this thing? And I guess that's the answer. I guess because if you don't know, it's like The Disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi, I think, is still the second longest animated movie ever made and the longest in the modern era. So, like, yeah, that all makes... And also, like, how did they get away with things like, we'll talk about this next time, The Endless Eight? And I guess this is the answer. They could do whatever they wanted.
Yeah, it's like, because it is one of the reasons why I wanted to be so thorough about going through the popularity stuff here, is because I think if you're removed from that original context, you don't know. Because I knew at the time, because like this is the kind of thing where if you were online at the time in like the late 2000s, kind of like how like even if you didn't know anything about, I don't know, fucking like Final Fantasy VII, you see everyone's Final Fantasy VII fan art, right? It was the same thing with Haruhi. Like you saw the Haruhi character in fan art and stuff all over the place, whether you're looking for it or not. So that's how I became originally aware of it, and I knew it was super popular. And I knew like the Haruhi Yukai song, I had heard that and been, you know, people had made meme videos and stuff on it back when memes used to be a thing and not like random images of cats with text on them, but it was like an actual viral thing. And so, yeah, it's like, it's a very different context now if you're just watching it and don't realize that. But this show, to me, like, it kind of blew the door open for this is the model with which you become super successful in the modern late night anime sphere. And you can have 13 or 14 episodes and still like get enough of a fan base to be able to do all these things. Largely, I think the internet was like the key difference here. The internet created a space for people to discover and share the show and sort of build that fandom much more organically, even if it only could take place over the course of, you know, a couple of months, right? One of the reasons why it's hard for a show that only has 14 episodes to get popular traditionally is you've only got 14 weeks to watch the show, right? You only got 14 weeks to build that audience. Whereas if you have a show like a Gundam, well, you've got a whole year for that to start picking up pace and stuff like that and to become a thing that people are interested in. And so that shift in like kind of viewing habits with the beginning of the internet, Haruhi was one of the first anime to really take advantage of that. And it's still the model that shows become successful today. Like all the stuff I talked about with like the doujinshi, the Odote Mita, or like cover song phenomena of the OPs and EDs, like the voice actors performing the songs live at concerts and stuff. Like this is exactly how Bocchi the Rock became hugely popular. And when I saw Bocchi the Rock and saw that show start going viral, it made me think of Haruhi a lot because it like followed all the exact same kinds of trends that this show did. And so I think like the egg that Haruhi cracked in 2006 for this kind of market is still fundamentally the way it works today. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah. I also just wanted to make a note. I'm curious. You mentioned earlier that maybe some early DVDs had the broadcast shuffle order. I've been researching that and I haven't found it. What I'm aware of is that the original DVD volumes in Japan, and this was actually copied exactly for the original US volumes in 2007, is that they started, episode 1 was always the episode 0, the Mikuru, like, movie episode, and then it was chronological, so the 6 Melancholy episodes, and then after that point. And I've been going through eBay, I've been going through Yahoo Japan, like, I've just been trying to figure this out, because I'm super curious. I have not found any examples of it in the actual shuffle order, like released on physical media officially, and I think that's like deeply fascinating to me. I don't know if it's ever had like a digital release that way. That would be much harder to search for and find, but it's wild.
Yeah, I was under the impression that the original Japanese release had it in broadcast order, but I mean, obviously I don't own it, so...
No, the original Japanese was, it was that redone where it still had episode 0 at the beginning, and then it did chronological, is my understanding.
I mean, I guess that makes sense because they're, like, as far as I can tell, there were originally next on previews, because, like, notably they're not there. if in any release I have ever seen of it. But I know they exist because in the official fan guidebook, which I have found a scan of this, they have the text of them at the end of each episode section they discuss. So they originally had next on previews. That must be why, like, I've never, even in pirated versions, never seen that anywhere. They presumably, because they wouldn't, obviously, if you change the order, you wouldn't leave the next on preview, because it wouldn't make any sense. But that was like the organic way in which the show told you what the next episode was going to be. So that's how you would find out, oh, the next episode after the murder mystery isn't going to sort of like pay that off. The text of the next episode preview tells you that.
Yeah, and my understanding is that in that next episode preview, doesn't Haruhi even like tell you like this one's next chronologically, this one is next in the shuffle order?
Yes, she tells you the wrong episode number technically, but it's like the right episode number. Yes, okay. So yes. And then Kyon gets mad at her and says like, no, that's not what it is. No, like next one is episode 6, which is this episode. Yeah, that's basically what that text says.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. All right. So the last little note here in terms of on the cast and crew here. So as I said, the true director of the show is super director Suzumiya Haruhi. She's top billed, so you got to give her credit. Under her is director Ishihara Tatsuya, of course, who we're very familiar with at this point because he did all the key shows as well. The script credit I love, which is I've translated as Suzumiya Haruhi and her delightful pals. It's like Yukai na Nakamatachi is what it says in Japanese. So there is no series composition credit. So there's no like one writer who is like the person in charge of the scripts at that top level. It was mostly just sort of like divvied up. So several of the episodes are written by the episode director. So like episode 0 is directed and written by Yamamoto Yutaka. But there are many exceptions. So like Fumihiko Shimo, whom we are very familiar with, he wrote episodes 8 and 13. He is our heir, Kanon, Clannad, and Clannad After Story guy. This, of course, would have been about 6 months before Kanon aired. So it's like, in between writing all those episodes, he's like, I'll do 2 episodes of Haruhi. One I like, Shoji Gato, the creator of Full Metal Panic, wrote episode 11, which I believe is the Day of Sagittarius one. Episode 7 was written by the producer Ito Atsushi under the pseudonym Ito Joe, which I just love. I love that the producer of the show is like, sure, I'll write an episode. And then for whatever reason, I didn't put in my notes right here, but Someday in the Rain, the best episode of the show and the one you've already been talking about, that episode is written by Tanigawa Nagaru, the author of the light novels, and we'll talk about that when we get to Someday in the Rain.
Is that one based on a story? I was looking through the list, and I don't think I saw it. Okay, yeah.
No, so that's why he's the one who wrote it, is that's the only one that's original to the show. So then the most interesting one, and a credit I had to do a lot of research on, is Yamamoto Yutaka, the infamous piece of shit, who of course he did good stuff on the show, which is, you always hate it when someone you hate does something good. But he did some really good episodes on the show, but he's a absolute bastard. But he had the series Inshutsu credit, which I've just left that untranslated here because it's a credit I don't know how you translate it. It's a very weird credit that exists on almost no other shows except for Sound Euphonium. And in my doing research of this, I've realized I've misunderstood some of the credits for Sound Euphonium because they've been translated weirdly into English. So series Inshutsu, if you translated it very literally, it would translate as series director. And I've seen places translate it that way, which is a bad way to translate it because that implies to me that that's the top person,
yes.
Right? The series director sounds like the person who's directing the overall series. No, it's flipped, right? Ishihara Tatsuya is the one who's the top build director under Suzumiya Haruhi. He's the one who has like the full creative control of the show. The series Inshutsu, with Inshutsu being the same credit you give for like episode director, is what we translate as episode director is Inshutsu. So it's a kind of director role. But that is like underneath the role that Ishihara Tatsuya has, and Ishihara basically described the responsibilities in the interview as the series Inshutsu's job is to voice their opinion and make proposals at all elements of the production. And then the director's job is to determine the pros and cons of those ideas and determine how to execute them. So it seems like it's kind of like almost like a co-director role, but like a step down from that. So like the director still has ultimate authority, but Yamamoto Yutaka had input at all the different levels of production, the marketing, the like music, the obviously like episodes, like storyboarding, like all that. He hit that across the whole show as well as doing a couple of episodes that he directed. This, interestingly, is the same credit that Yamada Naoko has on the Sound Euphonium TV show. And I have been under the impression that Yamada Naoko was the main director of the Sound Euphonium TV show because she's credited in most places as series director, and that's wrong. Ishihara Tatsuya is the top director of Sound Euphonium outside of the Liz and the Blue Bird movie, and Yamada Naoko is this series Enshitsu role. So that's the thing where people need to get on top of their shit and translate this, because it's that there's a lot of places online that are miscrediting both of these shows pretty egregiously based on that. So that's the Yamamoto Yutaka of it all. Then in terms of character design and chief animation director, this is also something where I have to make a correction based on an erroneous English source that I now realize was wrong. But this is Ikeda Shoko. So she was the major animator at KyoAni. She did key animation on everything we've watched so far. I have previously said on the podcast that she and Ikeda Kazumi, who was the character design and chief animation director on Clannad, that they were sisters because there are some English sites that say that. That's wrong. That is just a mistranslation of Ikeda Shoko's Wikipedia page, which says very directly that they are not related, and it's a coincidence. And someone didn't know negative in Japanese and just like sort of putting that in like Anime News Network and places like that. And I should have, of course, gone to a Japanese source on that. So I apologize for miscrediting those. Obviously, they're both very good. So Ikeda Shoko is character design chief animation director on all of these, and she is on the other Haruhi stuff as well. We'll also see her work in those roles in Sound Euphonium, but she also just works on everything. She does animation work on basically everything we're watching the show. Really sadly, though, this is one where I have to say that she was one of the people killed in the arson attack in 2019. So sadly, Ikeda Shoko is no longer with us, but her stuff on Haruhi is incredibly good. And particularly, I think, like, the character designs are good middle space of some of the stuff we talked about with Clannad, where they're sort of like flexible enough that like they really can do a lot with the character designs, but also they really sort of capture that much more kind of grounded aesthetic of Haruhi as a show that wants them to really feel like real people and not anime characters. And I think like that's like a really delicate balance that I think she struck incredibly well on this show.
Absolutely. And, we are jumping back in time from where we were last time. So This is several years before Clannad, right around the time of Kanon. But I think if you put this and Kanon next to each other, I do think this is the better show visually. Yes. I think Kanon hugely accomplished on that level, but I think you're getting some of the, like, just sheer, like, fluidity and, like, just the sense of overwhelming like presence and thought to the movement of characters that you'll get on Clannad, you're starting to really see here. And then this one is also much more, again, a little playful and experimental with its framings and its storyboardings and stuff, and really kind of, in some episodes, letting their freak flag fly on how weird they're going to make the shot compositions. And so it's a really bold piece of animation.
Yeah, and it's like there's just a lot of different kind of stylistic things they do throughout with like the framing of the characters and the backgrounds and that kind of stuff that can get just fucking weird in episodes, and all that stuff's great. And then the last credit for the music. So the music of the series was composed by Kosaki Satoru. His best known work by far is he does the music for the Monogatari series, which is very long and has a lot of music in it. And he has done all of the opening themes for that series, which if people don't know, that show changes the opening theme every 5 to 6 episodes because each arc is themed around a different character, and they do an opening theme for each of the characters. And sometimes when it goes back to another character's storyline, it will then do a new theme for that character. So he's done a lot of fucking opening themes for that show, and they're all really good. In particular, like the huge one that was a massive viral hit was Renai Circulation, sung by Hanazawa Kana. He didn't do the opening and ending themes in terms of he didn't compose them. Those are different composers. But he did do the 2 insert songs, which I think you can definitely tell are his style because they're very Western and he's good at capturing that kind of Western rock style. But he did God Knows and Lost My Music from the Alive episode. But the music across the show, I don't know if it stands out to me quite as much as the key stuff we've done, but there's a lot of really good music. Particularly, I love the sort of daily life theme in the show. That's just like, it's the most high schoolers going about their business song you have ever heard in your life.
I love the music. I think when it gets jazzy, y'all know from the Loop on the third season, I like when anime music gets jazzy. There's some really good jazzy music in here. I think often the music is not the soundtrack you would expect for this series, and that's something I like about it. It is one of the many curveballs the show is throwing you, and I think it melds really well. And then also is sometimes, again, very playful and weird and off-kilter in ways that absolutely complement a show that is weird and playful and off-kilter.
Yeah, well, the thing I think that, like, the good get they got with Kosaki Satoru is that he has, like, a really huge repertoire of genres he can do, which you see in the Monogatari series with all the different styles and genres of songs he wrote for that series. And so, like, Haruhi as a show is so flexible in terms of its genre, that when you do the murder mystery episodes, the soundtrack for those episodes, for most of it, sound very different than the other episodes, or you get, like, the pseudo-classical stuff in the last couple episodes of the show. And so that's, like, one of the big things that stand out to the music is that it's very adaptable to what all the insane bonkers shit the show does, whether it's, like, insane and bonkers on a, like, here's a giant of light smashing a city, or we're just going to be a show that's going to hold on a cut of one character reading a book for 3 minutes straight. It's like he's got to do music that exists in a show that has that much of a disparity in style and approach.
Absolutely. One question, did they reanimate the opening and ending theme for season 2? Because in the versions we were watching on the Blu-ray, they look several years newer, but there is a creditless version of the full dance that looks like it was from the actual 2006 airing as a bonus feature.
No. So I think the opening and ending themes, they may have, like, I think they were touched up slightly more, for another release, because, like, the actual animation of the episodes, if you have the Funimation Blu-ray, like, they can sometimes, it looks a little, like, compressed. Like, it's not, I think, like, the best Blu-ray release. It's also,
I don't think it's compressed. I think the encoding is fine. It's been blurred. It's been, like, DNR'd a little bit to make it look more, because it's an old standard def show, it's an up-res problem, but that's not Funimation's fault. My understanding is that's how the Japanese Blu-rays look too.
Yeah, and we'll see the same thing with Lucky Star. It's just you wish it looked a little bit more clean.
Lucky Star has a separate issue I will talk about because I've researched this, but I'll let people know at the end because there's a whole different can of worms with that one. Yeah,
I'm glad that you're handling that research because you know a lot more about that stuff than I do. Because yes, I know that the Lucky Star Blu-rays can look pretty rough in some places. But yeah, like, I believe that some of the OP and ED stuff was reanimated for a different later release, and they look really gorgeous. It is, if you want to have a good time, if you want to understand how, like, video compression works on streaming, you can watch the opening theme of Haruhi on any streaming website, and the part where the stars come out and the characters are on the stars and it kaleidoscopes in the background and there's, like, characters swinging by the screen, it just chews it the fuck up with any fucking compression software. Like, that's just a blurry ass mess if you're not watching it on physical media or it's on a really premium, like, downloaded video. But yes, those openings and endings are slightly more modern.
Because it's the same opening and ending on the season 2 episodes, right? Or is it?
No.
Oh, it is different? Okay.
No. So that's one of the most bizarre things about season 2 is that
just switches.
You're just watching an episode that starts with Boken Desho, and the next week, oh hey, here's Super Driver. And it's like, I guess that means this is one of the new ones. I haven't watched any of those episodes on the Blu-ray, but there is a season 2 OP and a season 2 ED, and I assume that they put them in these because where else would they be if you didn't get Super Driver?
Okay, yeah. Anyway, I was just going to say, like, I briefly spot checked those, and you can tell, like, that's another weird thing with when we watch season 2 is the animation will look a little different because they were made 3 years apart in a period of anime history where 3 years might as well have been 30, and that's also why my guess is that they reanimated those opening and endings because they don't have any of the up-res. They don't look up-res. They look like native 1080p. This would, Kanon has only had a DVD release in the US, and this, like, frankly would make... I actually imagine it's possible there's some DVDs of Haruhi that look better than the Blu-rays because they don't have the up-res problems, but I haven't gone that deep into looking into it. But anyway, I'm getting us off track. There's a lot to talk about here.
Yeah. And I believe, although, like, to one point, I am fairly sure that the ending theme, like, when they reanimated stuff, they did not change the composition. So, like, the full dance version, that was always a bonus. So the way the show originally aired still had, like, the cuts within the dance, so it wasn't you just had the uninterrupted dance. So the
uninterrupted dance is a bonus, and if you look at it, it's blurrier, it's up-resed, it's the same thing as the body of the episodes, not the opening and ending. So that's why I'm saying there's a difference.
Yeah, and so I believe that original full dance animation was just a bonus on the original DVD releases in Japan, presumably.
Yeah. And it is good. If you've never watched it, it is very fun.
Yes, I was actually shocked because I had forgotten that the original animation had like the cuts into like, here's some shots from the show in there, and I was like, oh my god, that's right. I just always, because I've every year or so I'll go back and watch Hare Hare Yukai, the dance on YouTube, because it's fucking great, and I had forgotten that that's not what it actually showed at the end of every episode.
They had to make room for the titles somewhere. There's a lot of credits they have to credit people, you know?
Yes,
no, I also have to praise that Hare Hare Yukai dance, because that was when I was editing the theme song for this season of Japanimation Station with the new song that my brother Thomas wrote us. You guys have seen it several times by now. There's a part near the end where it starts going, we're going on a Kyoto, and it was watching the theme song to Haruhi, or Hare Hare Yukai specifically, that I went, I've got it. And that's where it's, at the end, there's a series of people dancing to the Kyoto, and it's with people like raising their arms in dance, and it was from the specific cut I used from Haruhi gave me that idea, and I built that ending sequence around it. The dance is very good.
The dance is very, very good. If you want to have a good time with the dance, during the pandemic, Hirono Aya, the voice actress for Haruhi, did a video where she uploaded herself doing the dance, and then Sugita Tomokazu, the voice actor for Kyon, who is a giant goofball, did the same thing, but he didn't rehearse the dance at all, so it's just him wildly flailing about trying to remember what the dance was, and it's one of my favorite videos online.
That's fantastic.
Japanimation Station.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can support the show directly on Ko-fi at the link in the description, and remember to check out the Weekly Stuff podcast, our long-running series on movies and video games and everything else on all platforms.
And now, back to the show.
All right, so Sean, can we finally talk about the body of this crazy ass show?
Yeah. How do we talk? So, because for me, the thing I'm most fascinated about, Jonathan, is your experience watching this show.
Yes.
Because when you've already seen Haruhi and you know the story, you know the characters, in some ways watching the shuffle order becomes a purely intellectual exercise. Because it's like, I mean, not only do I know all the context for like episode 0 / episode 1 in what season 1 tells you, I know everything, all the other stuff that season 2 is going to give you even more context for that. So it's like, I can't just sort of forget that information. So, you know, like it's fun watching the shuffle order, but again, it feels slightly intellectual in that you can never kind of recapture the experience of watching a badly made student film represented in anime as an introduction to the show when you don't know any of the characters. That's just not an experience you can ever have twice. So I want to know, Jonathan, what were your thoughts and how were you feeling when you booted up the Blu-rays, you started watching that episode, and it got Mikudun, and that was your introduction to this show?
It's so confusing and weird and wacky. I loved it. I mean, that first episode is, I think, brilliant just as a production in how it is. It's like really, it nails the look of like 90s digital anime in that, which is kind of what it's going for, is because it's doing a low rent, like Haruhi and her friends shot this, but the way they're representing that is they're kind of making it look like a standard def anime from the 90s, and it's very funny. And all of that aesthetic side of it I thought was amazing. I think it's such the perfect first episode, and it's the perfect first episode in a couple of ways. Like, it honestly, to the degree that it kind of angers me that the modern Blu-rays don't just keep it as the first episode, because it's the intro. It is, I think, such a good intro to the entire kind of, like, it's like a thesis statement to the show, in that it is weird and it is experimental. There are large parts of it that are, as much of the show to follow will be, is kind of weird and durational, where like the camera angles are wrong, and you'll be like sitting on a scene for a while because Kyon has forgot to cut here, and there's stuff like that, and it's very like off-putting and funny in that way. Then you have the extra, layer of this that it's out of chronology. So this is your intro to these characters, and it's through this weird student film. Then there's the bonus layer that you don't know it yet if you're me, but Mikuru being a future girl, she actually is. Haruhi just doesn't know that. Like, all the people in the show are the people they are in real life. by pure coincidence, because Haruhi is a crazy person and has made it this way in more ways than one, which is the central metaphor of the show, and we'll talk about that. But then I think the real thing that ties it together and makes it work so well as a premiere is at the end, they finish watching the movie. We're back in like widescreen modern for 2006 animation, and everyone is sitting there in the theater going, oh my god, this was awful, this is so embarrassing. And then we have Haruhi stand up, and it's our first line from Aya Hirano on the show, and she is so, perky and happy about it. And you have this big camera shot from below. You see the Ultra Director sash she's got on her arm, and then that is how we meet Suzumiya Haruhi, is from this big, like, low-angle shot as she's standing triumphant, having made her shitty movie. And that, like, I can't imagine a better introduction to Haruhi Suzumiya. Like, her introduction as a character in the second episode, which is really the first episode, is also very good, of her standing up in the middle of class and saying, like, I want to meet espers and future people. It's not as good as the ending of this episode where she's making a crazy movie. That is the best way to meet Suzumiya Haruhi.
Yeah, and it's absolute madness, because because, like, to give a little bit of context of what the student film is, like, we will get more material about it in season 2, because one of the big things season 2 adapts is the second light novel, The Sigh of Suzumiya Haruhi, which is about them making this movie. And then in one of the later volumes, there's a short story, which is the movie itself, and that's what this episode is adapting. But there are all these hooks in here, where, like, when we rewatch this in season 2, you're going to see it completely differently, because you will see the entire making of. But there's a lot of really weird shit that happens. That's not just the weird shit of these people don't know how to make a movie, and it's like these kids and they're just like goofy. It's like Shamisen, the cat, starts talking at one point, and Yuki smacks him in the head with her little wand and just looks at the camera and says, that was ventriloquism, and just goes back to her lines, right? And
I had no idea what to make of that. My initial thought was, is this someone off screen doing the voice and that's the joke? And then I think I vaguely remembered someone telling me about a talking cat in one of these shows, and I'm like, is that it? Because we never meet a talking cat in season 1. It's wild.
Yeah, and so there's a bunch of stuff like that, and I'm not going to go through all of it, obviously, for the fun of season 2. But I guess, like, the point being, like, there's so much information in there that the first time you watch it, you have no context to be able to kind of, like, decode what it is and what it's telling you. And it's insane, because it's not like they were making this thinking there was going to be a season 2. I'm sure in the back of their head, they're like, hey, it would be cool if we could do more episodes of this at some point if it got very popular. But they knew when they were making this, they're not doing The Sigh of Suzumiya Haruhi. They're not adapting any of those. This show was meticulously planned in pre-production, more so than most anime. Like, one of the things I learned reading through some of the interviews in the visual guidebook, which I didn't have time to read all of it, but because there's a lot. But some of it was, like, became clear, they had a lot of planning meetings where they had everybody, including the voice actors, there to try to, like, make sure everyone was on the same page on, like, what is happening at what point in the show. Because if it's confusing for the viewers, imagine how confusing it is for the people involved making it to try to keep straight when things happen and how you have to read a certain line depending on things that haven't happened yet for you as an actor, but of course have to have happened for the character, but also the viewer hasn't actually seen it yet, right? So there's, like, so much weird shit that has to go into that the pre-production has to be very meticulous. And part of that is them, like, having all of this really rich source material that they're adapting a relatively small percentage of what was released even at that point in 2006, and sort of embedding a lot of the information of that source material that they knew they weren't going to put into the show. Which it's like, I think that there's something really cool about them saying, you know what? Because we're not, like, I feel like other productions would go, since we're not adapting that story, or we're not pulling in that character, we're not doing that thing, we're just going to cut it out completely, right? Shamisen the cat doesn't show up anywhere else in season 1 of Suzumiya Haruhi because he's only in that second volume. But they still fucking put him in this movie, and they still did the whole joke where he talks and all that shit, and even if you have no idea why. And it's one of the things that will make season 2 weird, is that, like, oh, well, now everything, or it makes it not weird, because everything actually can hook up because they've adapted it so faithfully. But the process of what that means for season 1 is you're given a lot of information that you don't know what is and isn't important. You don't know what does and doesn't matter, because there's a lot of information that is effectively junk information in the context of season 1 that will not be brought up again, that will not be followed up on again in the context of this season. And I think that makes a really fascinating, chaotic viewing experience of where you're thrown into the deep end and you're having to try to decode everything that's being thrown at you. And then
I also
all of that
think,
is... Okay,
oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
Well, I just
Yeah,
think
go.
also, like, it's a great approach, I think, to adapting something that you have a lot of source material with, and you only have one core of anime, and you don't know if you're going to have more. I think not just most, any other adaptation, what they would have done if they had one core is they would have done the Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya episodes 1 through 6, and they would have done the Sigh of Haruhi Suzumiya
Yes.
episodes 1 through 6, and then probably the finale would have been the Mikuru movie thing as like our fun ending, right? And that would have been what they would have gotten through. And I think that would have been a much less rich season of TV. It would be you would see so many fewer sides of the characters, and the choice that this season, and the reason it's called The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, is it's really just that. It is that book is your spine. And then everything else is taken from later, appended on the sides, not before, but after, all over the place. And that makes for a show that I would imagine, if you were a fan of the books, probably actually is a much better representation of those books as a whole than if you had just gotten to do the first 2 novels and nothing else. Like, it's a much bigger, like, here's pieces from all over that we're getting. And the characters, I think, probably feel a lot more full and rich than if you were just adapting, like, linearly what you could get through in one season.
Yeah, because it is fascinating, because they basically adapt stuff from the first 6 volumes, which is mostly what was out by the time they would have been planning the show. Volume 4 is the disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi. So when we get to the movie, that's what Volume 4 is. So some of this stuff, like the Live Alive episode, this episode, the Zero, like that stuff those are short stories from Volume 6 that are set before that movie. But I do find it just fascinating that they adapt those first 6 volumes and they don't take anything from the second one, which is the only other one at that point. Other than you have basically the first volume, the second volume, and the 4th volume, Disappearance, are the ones that are the single story ones, and they only adapt the first volume for the single story. They skip volumes 2 and 4, and they're just pulling stuff from 3, 5, and 6 in terms of the short stories. And as I say, it's a very radical approach, because you would normally just take it in order, and you just go, yep, we have our Melancholy storyline, we have our Psy storyline, and then we're done. And instead, they're like, let's take the spine of the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi, the first novel, which tells, as the first light novel volume always is going to, because you don't know if it's going to be popular or not, it tells an open and shut story about these characters that you can have more adventures with, but it's a very complete narrative. And then let's like flesh it in with like some of these stories about what they do afterwards. And it does make just like a much more engaging thing to do it that way than just to sort of like smack your head against like the chronological storyline, especially when the source material already has that very kind of playful spirit. In terms of episode 0, one of my favorite things about it, I think the thing that is really genius about it, that you especially appreciate more upon rewatching and you having the proper context, is that you don't see Kyon or Haruhi for almost the whole thing, but they are the 2 main characters of the movie, because Kyon is the one doing the narration, and he's fulfilling his role in the show, which is he is the one who is the sort of like filter for the insanity that Haruhi creates in the world, and he is the one who has to try to ground, process, and normalize it as much as possible. And then Haruhi is the one who creates the insanity and the madness. And even though Haruhi, you like get a couple of moments where you hear her off camera, or she jumps into the frame right before it cuts, so you see like glimpses of her in the movie, but you only see her full bodied in that incredible like spinning shot in her reveal at the very end. But the fact that she's the director of the film means that she is the main character of that movie. Because all the choices that are being made, all the things that like Nagato and Koizumi and Mikuru are going through, all the dumb shit that's happening in this film, all of that is Haruhi. And it's like you kind of especially like appreciate that on second viewing, where you see that kind of invisible hand of the director behind the camera. And when you know who she is as a person, like you understand the thought process that is going behind this stupid fucking thing they're making. And Kyon desperately trying to make it make some kind of sense. Like it is this incredible sort of experimental demonstration of the core fundamental like sort of concept of the show, which is that push and pull between those 2 central characters, even though everything you're seeing on screen is Mikuru, Nagato, and Koizumi. And those characters are like, they're most heavily visually featured, but you don't really learn anything about who those people are in this episode. It is entirely about Kyon and Haruhi, and that's like so cool and just an absolutely kind of genius move that makes it an insane but incredibly engaging first episode for the show.
Yes, absolutely. And like a very clear call and response to what the finale of season 1 will be, which is sort of fully laying out for us that relationship between what Kyon and Haruhi is that we have seen from that beginning point on through in all these different scenarios. So can I give my spiel on my overall thought on the shuffle order and why they did this creatively?
Yes. Go ahead.
So I have two ways of reading this. I think first is kind of a practical, like, what was the best way to tell the story reason. And I think that is that the central metaphor of this series is fairly simple. It is a girl who has a magnetic personality and strong force of will who builds a group of friends out of all these misfits, only the metaphor being she has literal powers to remake the world and do this, right? A fairly simple metaphor. That said, the mechanics to lay out that metaphor are really fucking complicated and involve reams of exposition and weird shit and Evangelion-style imagery in the enclosed spaces and all this stuff, right? So instead of doing it linearly and front-loading the show with exposition, which I think is... I'm very curious how I'm going to react to those 6 episodes as the beginning of Season 2 when it's all in chronological order. But they dole out later stories where we see the results of Haruhi's strangeness having brought these people together, and we're basically seeing cause and effect as a parallel instead of a chronology. And I think that makes the laying out of the metaphor in the exposition clearer in the chronologically, like, earlier parts of the story. So, like, this is similar to what I said about Kara no Kyokai, the Garden of Sinners, when we watched that in Season 2 of Japanimation Station, is that the reason that moves out of order is that it's Kinoko Nasu wanting to show us the result of something or something in action before it is exposited to us. So we have some kind of visceral understanding of it before we have the literal, here's the dictionary definition of it. So, like, enclosed spaces are not defined for us until the 13th of 14 episodes in this season. But we see them in action several times. And, you know, I think even more important than that, we see the friend group in a series of status quo situations in, you know, mini environments before we see the exact literal series of steps that cemented them together. And I think all of that just, I think, captures the audience and their imagination in a way that I think a purely linear version of this wouldn't do on the same dimension. And I think that's the practical storytelling level. The other read is, I think, to me, in the more experimental vein, where this show is just kind of avant-garde, is that it's kind of a structuralist experiment. It's like arrange episodes more or less at random. You've got this forward moving linear spine in the middle, and see if and how the audience draws connections and explanations for the structure as it goes along. Because I think some of the episode placements are extremely purposeful. Like episode 1, we've already been talking about the Mikuru episode at the very beginning. Yes, that's very, very intentional. Other ones I think are more playful, like having the two-parter interrupted by the episode that comes right before the two-parter. I think you can draw some reasoning of, like, there's stuff that happens in Mysteric Sign that does you can read back into part 2 of that two-parter, blah, blah, blah. But I actually think that's less the creators intended that than I think you read into it. And I think that's sort of a fundamental project of Haruhi, is that it's a very defamiliarizing show. It's defamiliarizing the slice of life high school club comedy in a way where it looks like a pretty normal show you understand, and it isn't in all these various sorts of ways. And I think the moving back and forth through time is part of that. And then I also think as the show goes along and you get particularly deep into it, and again, the Someday in the Rain episode being the key turning point for me, is that you start to understand that it's actually a really interesting way to present a sort of slice of life story where the status quo is such that days and events blur and blend kind of back and forth in time. And I think that all works together to express the solidity of the group at a certain point. So I think neither of those interpretations is, like, definitive, but I think they're both at work at the same time throughout this season.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, there's something about there's a chaotic and anarchic soul at the heart of the Haruhi series, right? And that's Haruhi herself, right? She, like, thrives on this kind of chaotic energy that wants to rip apart anything that is sort of, like, simple, boring, easily explained, easily understood, right? She is rebelling against the world as it exists as a practical phenomena because then she has to be normal, she has to be ordinary, and she has to be boring if she does that. And she has to live like a normal, ordinary, boring life, fall in love with a normal, ordinary, boring guy, go to normal, ordinary, boring college, get a normal, ordinary, boring job, and like live the same life that every other person on the planet lives, which is, of course, the thing that all of us eventually have to do. But her adolescence is fundamentally rebelling against that fact, even if she understands intellectually that that's what she's doing, right? And we'll talk about the psychology of Haruhi in some of those later episodes. But that's like part of the core sort of like philosophy and perspective of the character. And so the like them saying that Haruhi is the super director is a very funny joke, but it's also is legitimate. Like it is like legitimately their framing for how they're understanding the show is they're looking at it. It's the same thing I said of the way that they marketed the show for the light novel in the magazine. It's like they're trying to do it in a way that would make Haruhi happy or please her, right? So it's like we are all being flung around by the mad whims of this 14-year-old girl, the exact same way that Kyon and Nagato and Mikuru and Koizumi are in the show. Like we, the audience, are other members of the SOS Brigade flung at the whims of this bizarre girl. And so this kind of madness of, no, that's boring. Like, it's boring to start with the first episode. Let's start with episode 25 or whatever the fuck. Or, obviously it wouldn't have been season 2 yet. But, my point is like, we can't just like show who the killer is immediately. No, we got to put another episode in the middle, right? Like, those seem like things that Haruhi herself would do in her like weird adolescent insanity. And I think it's like, that's part of what the show is also reflecting is that kind of core philosophy and spirit of the engine that drives the show underneath it all. And there's something very exciting about that.
Absolutely. And this is actually where there's a part of me that thinks why this has never been issued on home video in the shuffle order is that Haruhi would like it that way. Haruhi would like it for you to get up and have to change discs constantly in your Blu-ray set. Like, I think that, and my dissertation I'm writing has a series of sort of like interlude chapters that sort of meditate on some issues that like aren't really part of the main body chapters but have some other interest. And I want to use this Haruhi example because I think it's an interesting, it opens up, I think, the space of like the DVD itself as kind of the first home archive medium that could do a lot of data, unlike like a VHS, is that there is a possibility for playfulness in the DVD, but it's not usually used that much. On anime, it is a little more because you might be switching back and forth between languages. But because of the way the Haruhi show is presented on DVD and Blu-ray, you have to engage with like the mechanics of the player and the apparatus so much more than on any other show you will ever watch. There's none of the like set it and then leave it alone. You have to like stop at the end of every single episode and go into the menu or pull out the disc or something. And those are small actions, but they are meaningful. Like I'm thinking the middle stretch of this show, Sean, I'm just looking at here are the numbers as they are in the full 28 episode order. There's a part that goes 10, 9. So you watch 10, go back to 9. Then it goes 11. So I have to switch to disc 2 to watch 11. Then 28. Switch to disc 3 to watch 28. Then 4. Go back to disc 1. Then 27. Go back to disc 3. Then 26. Okay, that's the one before that. Then 5 and 6 go back to disc 1. That amount of switching and everything is like, it's an experiment in a way that it literally makes the audience part of the experiment. It's like interactive in what it's having you do with the art. And I think that alone is kind of fascinating and also feels absolutely like what Haruhi herself would want you to do. She would find that very funny.
Yeah, because I believe that stretch from Mystery Sign to Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi Part 4, I think you switch to every single disc on the Blu-ray set. In that 4-episode stretch, you use all 4 discs, and it is like, I remember that being the part where I'm like, you motherfuckers. It's like, or you motherfucker Haruhi. Like, you're very right. That's like, there is something about that energy, that it captures that, because there's a meta quality to the show, right? And of course, like there is in the light novels, there is in the anime as well. I mean, obviously with the episode being directed by Haruhi, all that like stuff is super meta as shit, which is one of the things that makes this show feel very modern still, is it's still playing with all those kinds of ideas, and it makes it very engaging. And then and kind of like part and parcel to that is another element that shuffle order reflects about the philosophy of the show diegetically is the kind of like flexible nature of what reality is in the world of the show, in a way that also kind of reminds me of like the Kinoko Natsu stuff, like Kado no Kyokai and Fate, where like Haruhi's whims and her perceptions and her feelings change the world, but not in ways that are easy to quantify and easy to understand. It's not just everything she wants is just happens, right? It's like there's some sort of complex mechanism at place here that is causing sometimes very subtle and sometimes very dramatic shifts in reality. And what is and isn't changed by Haruhi is impossible to identify, right? Like, did Yuki exist before Haruhi wanted to meet aliens, or does she exist because Haruhi wanted to meet aliens, right? Like, there's no way to kind of determine what is reality at a fundamental level outside of Haruhi's influence, and where and how does that influence stretch. And so I think that sort of very disorienting perspective on what is quote unquote real within the show also sort of like makes sense when you extend it out to that sort of broadcast order, where what is reality and what is chronology, what is time, becomes more flexible and more confusing, and something you have to engage with as a viewer. And so in that way, the broadcast shuffle order also reflects the philosophy of the show.
Yeah, because I will also say, I think some of those middle episodes are the ones that are my least favorite in this season.
Yes.
I think the two-parter doesn't really work for me. I think the one in the middle, Mysteric Sign, would be substantially less interesting if it were coming 3 after episode 6, where it's basically just recapitulating exposition you would have already gotten. But I think the fun of them is the playfulness of the order. Like, that's the thing that I think they would be much more dull to me if they were not in the specific way they've been doled out to us.
100%. Yes. No, that episodes 6, 7, 8 in broadcast order is easily the weakest stretch of the show. And particularly Mystery Sign, I think, is like not even a particularly good episode. But it's like, but that stuff is mollified by you being able to engage with the madness of trying to sort of put together what is really happening here in like the order of things. 100%.
Yeah. And I just, I because of my education history, I got my BA and my MA at the University of Colorado, which is like the most avant-garde film school in America. That's just how I view a lot of things. And like my avant-garde senses just kept perking up throughout Haruhi. It is like, I really do think it is meaningful, you having to interact with the apparatus of the player in a different way. There is something like, I think, deeply experiential about what the show is doing on that level that is fascinating to me, and a lot of things going on in this show. And I know there's going to be even more in season 2, because that second Blu-ray has a box set of episodes called The Endless Eight. What are those going to be about? I have no idea.
Oh, yeah. So do you have anything else to say about the episode 1/episode 0?
No, and I think I'm glad we could kind of lay out the shuffle order now, so now we can talk about the actual episodes as we go through these, because there's so much going on here.
Yeah, because then we get episodes 2 and 3, or episodes 1 and 2, depending on how you look at them. Like, I do love that it's like the fact that episode 1 is also called episode 0 just makes everything even more confusing when you're trying to talk about the order of episodes.
I'm going through my notes right now, Sean, and I had just had the numbering here as the like big out of 28 numbers, so they just go 25, 1, 2, 7, and now I am putting in 1, 2, 3, 4 for myself, so you and I can be on the same wavelength here, because
because I put them all into just what their broadcast order is what I put into my notes, because it's absolute madness. But yeah, you have the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi Part 1 and Part 2, which is of course now where we get our more kind of formal exposition and introduction into these characters, into this world. And like one thing I think when I was watching this, something I didn't remember is like, especially with the shuffle order, how long you go on not knowing that this is a fantasy show. Like, you don't get that kind of actually told to you until the very end of the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi Part 2, which is when Yuki tells Kyon that she's an alien. And even at that point, depending on how you're viewing the show, you might not yet believe her until you get into the baseball episode, which kind of fully confirms there are fantasy things happening. But I didn't remember that you can watch the entirety of Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi Part 1 and most of Part 2 and not have any idea anything of that there's fantasy stuff at all, and certainly you don't know that Haruhi is a literal god, basically, in this world.
you don't have a firm sense of how the fantasy works until the final 2 episodes. I mean, there's, because again, at the end of part 2, who the hell knows? Yuki could be pulling his leg. That's like very unclear. Then you do jump ahead to the boredom episode, which confirms it a little bit more, but it is still in the very, like, you have a brief flash to the crazy monster that they see in the enclosed space. But other than that, it's still a lot of like talk. And then there's a lot of episodes in the middle that are very like mundane, and it's unclear if there are fantasy elements. And I actually think that's also part of what's interesting, is that there's this tension in the whole show where the viewer is left a little like unsure about it, which also I think reflects the nature of the magic and the fantasy in this world, which is that it is weird, and like, Koizumi has powers, but they don't work everywhere. They work in specific places, and like all these things. It is a fantasy show asterisk,
Yeah. It is fun, sort of just like going back to Kyon when he doesn't know what any of the shit is, and seeing this like innocent Kyon. But of course we have like the opening of episode 1 has him in a monochrome world, right, where he is giving us his narration about one of the reasons why I called this When Christmas Came to Otaku Town, is that the first thing that Kyon says in the show is about Santa Claus and whether or not he is someone who believes in Santa Claus, and then he can say affirmatively to you, no, it's like, when did you stop believing in Santa Claus? And he can affirmatively say he has never believed in Santa Claus, right? So it's like, that's our introduction to Kyon. That's like the heart of who this guy is. He is someone who never believed in Santa, right? Like, he's someone who never really believed in the fantastical things of the world. He tried to at a certain part in his youth. Like, he has an interest in aliens and espers and people from the future, but he doesn't really believe in them. And so he is someone who's trying to live a normal, plain life. And then, of course, that's when he bumps into Haruhi, who brings like literal color into his world, right? Certainly not the first show or movie or anything to do that mechanic of the black and white, and this character brings color, but it is like, there's something very notable and something incredibly memorable to me about that opening piece of narration, particularly that Santa Claus line, which is the first thing that is said in the book. And it's just such, I think, a very direct access to, this is who this guy is on a very fundamental level.
Yeah, it's the opening of Clannad, basically, also, which is,
yes.
hilarious, because we talked about that. Obviously, this was made before Clannad, although Clannad, the video game, was made before either of these. But yeah, it's a very good opening. It was very funny for me just watching this after Clannad and going, oh, it's another KyoAni show that starts with a boy who's kind of sad and down, and then he meets a wonder girl who changes his life. The thing is, Haruhi Suzumiya is very different than anybody in Clannad.
Yes, because then you get, I love the detail of, because you just get all the madness of her introduction. She has her very iconic line about, like, if there are any aliens or espers or future people, then come talk to me. Like, it's like, but normal people, I want nothing to do with you. And then you get all the stuff that's the best of every day of the week. She changes the number of like ponytails basically she has.
Yes.
And then it resets. And I love Kyoto's like, and I wonder what she looks like on Sunday, because he never gets to find out. And this is like some of like the most novelistic I feel like this whole series ever feels, is this episode 1/episode 2, where you're getting this like it's a very raw. Sugita, the voice actor, is reading you like this stretch of the book basically. Like it's so much just purely Kyon's perspective and his narration.
Well,
and you just kind of seeing this girl and these like her antics through the eyes of this young boy.
And it's a story type, I think, no matter where you live in the world, you're probably used to. Like, I definitely read books, okay, not quite like Haruhi Suzumiya, but stories about the, like, kind of bored boy, and then a girl comes to town or shows up who is crazy. It was making me think of, like, Stargirl, whatever, I forget the author of that, but that's, like, a popular book when we were kids. I think it recently resurged because it got, like, a Disney Plus thing or something. Now, the difference is Stargirl doesn't have actual magical powers. She's just weird. I like it when she has actual magical powers here, because it's even weirder. But yes, it is that kind of story structure we understand, of course, taken to a crazy nth degree. No, I love these first 2 episodes. The laugh I had, because I had known that this show had something called the SOS Dawn forever. Like, that's just a famous thing from this show. I didn't know what it stood for. I thought it just, SOS is a term we have,
Yes.
And I'm like, maybe it's just that. But then you get the end of this episode, what SOS actually stands for, and I laughed my ass off so hard I had to rewind and see the lines I missed because it is so fucking funny.
Yes, the Sekai o Oi ni Moiageru Tame no Suzumiya Haruhi no Dan. Which I love the way that Sigi says this line, which is basically like the Suzumiya Haruhi's brigade for like making the world a happier, like more fun place to be in. Basically, it's like it's such a ridiculous, like massive sentence that she's structured together to be the name of her brigade.
And then the third episode, part 2 of the Melancholy, has the whole thing where Haruhi steals the computer from the computer guys, which is the first time you see just how far she will go. It sets up the recurring theme of her, frankly, assaulting poor Mikuru, who just gets into increasing situations where Haruhi is the worst sexual offender in the history of anime to poor Mikuru. And that whole scene of her, like, stealing the computer and blackmailing the computer club guys and all that, I wrote in my notes, this makes me think this show might be about a cult leader forcing her followers to commit terrible crimes, because that's absolutely, it feels like Haruhi, if she wanted to start a cult, she could start a cult and get a lot of people to drink a lot of Kool-Aid.
Yeah. Well, I think this, like, these are like with Haruhi, what I think is so fascinating about her as a character is, like, in so many ways, she fits very cleanly into some, like, very obvious archetypes. Obviously, she's a tsundere character, right? Like, she's so much a tsundere character that I love this. In the official fan guidebook for this show, for each episode, they have a little thing in the bottom left where they rate her on, for this episode, where is she? Is she more tsun or is she more dere? And it's like a little, like, slider they have set on each episode. It's fucking hilarious. So she's very much a tsundere character. And she is in a, like, Western media perspective, particularly for, like, the 2000s, where this trope was particularly popular. It's kind of connected to some of the stuff you're talking about, Jonathan, like Stargirl. You have the manic pixie dream girl, right? A, like, archetype I think we don't really talk about, and it's not as common these days, but in the mid-2000s, it was everywhere in Western media, whether you're talking about, like, young adult fiction or, like, romance movies and stuff like that. The Manic Pixie Dream Girl is basically that character archetype, right? Of your, like, main character is boring guy living a boring life, but secretly probably inside there's something very special about him. And then he runs into this girl that is weird and kind of goes against the norms of society and is remarkable in some ways and kind of brings out something amazing in the boy. But I think what makes Haruhi an interesting character for both those archetypes is that she is and can be often an extremely unpleasant person. Like, she is actually, like, mean. She's actually unpleasant. She is thorny actually as a person. Like, not just in a playful, like, we want her to seem like an asshole. Haruhi's a fucking asshole. And the stuff she does sometimes is so mean and rude and wrong that she does to people, particularly to Mikuru. And, like, and sometimes I think it like, for me, like, it goes over a line and I'm like, no, this is, like, no, you gotta fucking stop. And I think there's something about that energy of where you are forced to, like, actually, like, struggle with, I know in the way that I think Kyon does, like, how much of what makes Haruhi remarkable is, like, something that you actually admire and want to learn from and grow from yourself and kind of get some of that spirit and that energy and that adventurousness she has, but also how much of this is something that causes her to be an unpleasant person. Like, there's a reason why everybody does not like this girl. It's because she's a fucking hard person to like. And then we'll see even more of that. There's some stuff in season 2 that will give us even more of that. And I know that there are some people that, like, really do not like this show because they just hate Haruhi so much. But I think that's, like, a really valid reaction. It's something the show is actually giving you space to, like, actually tackle with this character in a way that I appreciate, because so much those character archetypes are meant to sort of, like, present as, oh, maybe she's kind of mean and she's kind of unlikable at times, but really that's just, like, to make her more interesting. Here, I think they're actually asking you to wonder and think about, like, how good of a person is she and how much do you actually like her? Like, there's a lot of space for you to, like, explore your own feelings there with her.
But also, the kind of character types you were laying out earlier, Sean, with, like, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, which that's a term that was actually coined for the 2006 Cameron Crowe movie Elizabeth Town, where Orlando Bloom played a shoe designer, I remember this movie way too well, who tries to commit suicide at the beginning of the movie, and then he goes back to his hometown of Elizabeth Town, and he meets Kirsten Dunst, who is the original Manic Pixie Dream Girl, and brings him out of his shell and sends him on a cross-country journey and all this beautiful stuff, and then at the end they get together. That's not Haruhi Suzumiya at all, because Kyon doesn't come out of his shell in that kind of way. He is Kyon from the beginning to the end, and the specific arc of this season, both chronologically in terms of from Melancholy Part 1 to Someday in the Rain, but also in the specific way they've laid it out for us from Melancholy 1, all the out-of-chronology stuff to Part 6, is it is more about what Kyon brings out of her. And that Kyon fundamentally makes her comfortable with living normally within certain boundaries in the real world. So in the chronological reading, Someday in the Rain, that episode is about Haruhi being comfortable with boredom for the first time. And it is about her having that like quiet comfort with, I don't like that it's boring today, but I'm okay. And at the end of the day, I'm going to take Kyon's hand in the rain and we're going to be fine. And that is part of why it is one of the most beautiful episodes of anime ever made. And then in the way it's been structured, ending with Melancholy Part 6, is that one is about Haruhi seemingly going the furthest with her godlike powers, where she is on the brink of remaking the world. Kyon tells her to come back to their normal, boring world. She cannot understand a reason why to do that, and he embraces her and kisses her, and she has a reason, which is him. And I think that is also part of why, for me, it works, is that, A, as you say, she is genuinely abrasive in many ways, but also the arc of change is on her. Like, it is her burden to become a different, better person in the show. She is not, through her manic nature, making Kyon a fundamentally different person. It's actually the other way around.
Yeah, I like that analysis. Yes, because that's exactly it. Like she superficially fits into that archetype and that narrative structure, but in matter of fact, it is what is really occurring in a substantive level is the opposite, and it is just the thing that makes her like. It's the thing that makes her like this very memorable character that stands out amongst the pack. You know, there are so many characters that try to be like Haruhi before and after her, and there's just. Like, she is in some ways like the ultimate tsundere to me in that sense of like she actually represents, I think, the ideal of what that archetype in a substantive sense is trying to get at, which is like, the difficulties of dealing with a person like that can have this like incredibly sweet, affectionate, and kind of amazing side to them, but also can just be brutal and cruel to people and trying to sort of, which, we all know people in our lives that are like that because everybody has multiple sides to them and are capable of both like really good things and bad things. And it's like, it's the thing that makes her such a sort of like vivid and lively character. And so much of like the tsundere archetype, and look, I could like my kind of cheap, trashy anime shit too. So it's like, I'm not going to rub my nose up at it too much, but so often it's just there to make the character like more attractive in that moe kind of sense. And really, like, while moe is an important idea at the heart of Haruhi, and like the show is reacting to things related to moe, and it incorporates moe into the show in a very direct way, like, Haruhi recruits Mikuru because she is moe as fuck, right? And she wants to dress her in a maid outfit and all that kind of shit, right? Like, that's the whole point of why she gets in the group. But Haruhi herself is not really moe, like, as a character. Like, I think it's really hard to actually look at her that way because she's too real. And it's like she is like an actual adolescent 14-year-old girl in the ways that can be extremely unpleasant. And as someone who has to deal with a lot of 14-year-old girls as part of my job as a teacher, like, they can be so fucking unpleasant sometimes. And anyone I'm sure is a parent of a teenager knows that too, right? It's like they can be mean, cruel little people. And it's just like a nature of what it is to be an adolescent and, a human being in any sense. And I love that Haruhi is written that way. I love how sort of real she feels. And you get it particularly, I think, in these two episodes, sort of first episodes with her, because you're kind of trying to investigate her from a distance and try to like get into the head of this, like, who is this weird person that is like trying to make a display of the fact that they are different than everybody else, which we all, I think, know people like that too.
Yeah. And just talking about the structure again, when I talk about the show kind of reversing causality and cause and effect, I'm thinking also of like the Live Alive episode at the end, which has a really significant character moment for her where she does something fairly selfless and she is thanked for it and she doesn't really know how to react. That's what Kyon reflects on at the end of that episode. And then I believe Live Alive is the last one before we go back into the Melancholy Parts 5 and 6. And that is very much, you have on your mind, eventually Haruhi will be in this position where she is doing something and getting gratitude for it, and she is like, all the good parts of Haruhi are being put out into the world, and people other than Kyon are now able to see that. And then you go back to Melancholy Part 5 and 6, which is where Kyon effectively puts the down payment on that, right? Of like, I believe you can be this, Haruhi, come back with me. and you've seen she will be later on. And I think that's the intelligence, in part, of the out-of-order storytelling that they've embraced here.
Yeah, it's a lot of like you sort of like getting these glimpses of how things will turn out and then filling in the gap of how you got there. And the first time you do that is with this baseball episode, right? We have the boredom of Suzumiya Haruhi, which is where it is just like you are thrown so much into the deep end. Like one thing I love, this is another detail I had forgotten, is that fucking Koizumi hasn't actually been introduced yet.
Nope.
So you did, because he gets brought into the SOS Brigade in part 3 of Suzumiya Haruhi, which is the episode after the baseball one. So you just go into the baseball episode, and all of a sudden there's this dude who you obviously saw in the student film, but like you don't know who this guy is at all, and he's here and he's like talking with Kyon about enclosed spaces and god people and like all this fucking shit. And you know, Yuki, there's like references to her casting spells, and she casts a spell on the baseball bat to make it like magically hit the fucking baseball. I love how it's just bonkers it is, where it just gives you a taste of all of those kind of pieces of the fantasy stuff, even before Koizumi has been fucking introduced as an actual character in the show. It's great.
It's great, and this is another one where I think the out-of-order storytelling is really smart, in part because, so just looking at Melancholy Part 2 and 3, which in the middle you get the boredom episode, the baseball episode. So Part 2 ends with Yuki starting the exposition of I'm an alien, blah, blah, blah. And then part 3 is she has a bunch of that exposition, and then Koizumi is introduced, and he has a bunch of exposition. And I will say, and this is not me criticizing the show, I think it is something that is fairly intentional about the show, is that when you have characters, usually Yuki or Koizumi, sitting down and reading fucking reams of dialogue expositing at you, my eyes glaze over and I stop taking in what the subtitles are saying, and the voice actors like sounds become like music to me where I'm not distinguishing individual words. Like it is the kind of exposition that is dense on a level where I just cannot take it in and comprehend it, and I don't think it's necessarily even meant to be, because you know who else doesn't really give a shit about any of it is Kyon, and he's our POV, and he ends every time he is exposited at, he goes, that made no sense and didn't help me. And I think that's true in all of these. And I think if you're just watching Melancholy Part 2 to Melancholy Part 3, I think that would be like a little bit of a like ripcord situation for me, honestly, of like, this is a lot of dense exposition that makes no sense. But you know why it works? Is because you have the baseball episode in the middle to punctuate that and give you a big like example of what they are talking about, of what does it look like when the SOS Brigade has to keep Haruhi happy or the universe might end, and it's through a crazy baseball adventure. That is absolutely keeps it alive there, and I think gives a grounding to the exposition before and after it, and allows you to appreciate what they're doing formally, which is that in any of those expository scenes, they're marrying them to these really interesting series of often kind of off-kilter images or images of emptiness. In the second to last episode, you've got that long car ride that Koizumi and Kyon go on that is, I think, really visually interesting and sometimes visually wonky because of early CGI, but like all of that's fascinating. And I think you learn to watch the show from that regard of like, don't really try to understand what the crazy future people are telling you. You're not going to understand it, and you don't need to. This is about vibes, people. And I think this like ordering of episodes really helps you understand it's the vibes more than it is the, you're not going to be tested on this later. Don't worry about the word of all of it. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and I definitely think that 2, 3, 4, 5 is like one of the cleanest uses of the shuffle order, because I mean it fits. It's like a very extreme version of, but it fits that Kisho Tenketsu Japanese structure stuff we've talked about in a few episodes at this point. Of, you know, your key is your opening, show is continuation, ten is your twist, ketsu is your conclusion that combines the twist with the stuff from the first two parts, right? So it's a very extreme version, but the Melancholy Part 1 is your opening. Part 2 is your continuation that develops all those characters you got in that opening. Then you get the baseball episode Boredom, which is a crazy twist where you're like, okay, now I have to like, I'm given all this new information. And then the Ketsu, which is Part 3, that gives you all the information you need to process and kind of order all the madness you just got in that baseball episode. And it is a really like clean, very intentional structure. And I think you can feel it, like how smart it is there. And especially like Melancholy Part 3 is one of my favorite episodes of the show, because there is something so satisfying about the process of Kyon, like the structure of the episode is so clear of him going, he talks with Yuki at the beginning, and then at the middle of the episode, he talks with Mikuru and finds out about her being a future person. And then at the end of the episode, he talks to Koizumi and him being an Esper. And all three of them give him their explanations of what Haruhi is. And they're all slightly different, right? Like from Yuki's perspective, Haruhi is this creature that is able to create information from nothing, right? Because Yuki is like a humanoid interface for the information entity or whatever, right? That's like a data being. It exists as information. And so she's like, they're fascinated with Haruhi's ability to create something from nothing. Mikuru doesn't know really what Haruhi is. All she knows is that they can't go back more than 3 years from where the story is currently set, right? So the people from the future who have time travel, the furthest back they can go is 3 years before this story. And I love that they don't even adapt the episode in season 1 that tells you what happened 3 years ago. That's a season 2 episode. So it's like, I forgot that was not what season 1 was, and that's very funny to me. So you never even really find out what that 3 years ago thing exactly was. There are lots of like little hints at it, but yeah, so you get that with her, and then at the very end you get, I think, like what I think you're meant to understand as the most accurate explanation, as accurate as it could be, of Haruhi's abilities, which is Koizumi's, right? He's the one I think has like clearly the most like sort of precise understanding of her, as much as one can have a precise understanding of the kind of reality-defying abilities Haruhi has. But that's where he explains to Kyon that she is effectively a god, and that from a certain perspective, the world didn't, like the reason why you can't go back more than 3 years ago is that the world didn't exist past 3 years ago, and that everything was created by her from some perspective, right? Like what exactly that means is up to interpretation. But that is like, I think, the most cogent kind of explanation you actually get of what her abilities are.
Can you imagine how much more fun church would be if you were worshiping a crazy moe anime girl who just remakes the world, as the Big Bang is when she decides she wants espers, and so now the world has espers? Yes. No, I love that, and I'm looking through, you have your little screenshot gallery here, Sean, of the different images, and in episode 5, which is the Melancholy Part 3, like the way the show shifts its entire aesthetic language around everybody's expository monologue, I think is also super interesting. Like what they do with Yuki with all the crazy fisheye lenses, and like it looks like surveillance imagery, and you know, it is very computerized. And with Koizumi later on, it is more sort of open and exaggerated and empty. All of this is, and with Mikuru, it's a little more intimate because she's more of just like Mikuru. I know she's a girl from the future. She's like the most normal of the group other than Kyon in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I love that, like, with her, the only thing is that she's from the future. It's not like she has something from, like, magical future technology. It's not like she knows information that's going to be important. It's just she's literally a person from the future, and that's it. Obviously, like, the actual thing that's special and useful about her is when we meet adult Mikuru from further in her timeline that comes back to give Kyon that little, like, nugget of info. We will meet adult Mikuru more in some of the future stuff. But like the one that we know that we spend the most time with, she's not special in any way at all, other than that technically she's from the future, and I love it. It's so
it is very funny because she is just a nice normal girl who like Kyon has the hots for, mostly on like a fairly innocent level. He is hiding the pictures of her, but also like he has a real like crush on her because she's cute, you know.
She's moe, you know.
She's extremely moe, as Haruhi herself will tell us over and over again. Then we have this stretch, and I think we just have to take these episodes as a group, of Remote Island Syndrome Part 1, jump back to Mysterique Sign, and then jump ahead to Remote Island Syndrome Part 2. There's a lot of stuff I do like in these episodes, particularly Remote Island Syndrome Part 2 has some fascinating filmmaking techniques that go on in it. But overall, I do think this is the most sort of like down period of the show, where I think these stories are most interesting for their sequencing than what happens in them.
Yeah, I think particularly you've got Remote Island Part 1 and then Mysterique Sign are like kind of whatever episodes. I mean, I like the Remote Island Part 1 for just like, I mean, that one's basically a beach episode, you know? It's just like, oh, we're just kind of hanging out. But it's got some good setup with the like super detective Haruhi stuff. Then Mysterique Sign, I think, is just an overall fairly dull episode, you know? It's like... It's the one that feels by far the most formulaic for a series that is not formulaic really in any way, shape, or form. But the closest you get is something like that, where it's just so much, okay, here's a thing that's kind of mysterious that happens. It's been caused somehow by Haruhi's powers that she's not aware of. and then Kyon, Koizumi, Yuki, and Mikuru kind of work behind the scenes to try to resolve it. It's just not particularly interesting. It's got some fun little bits here and there. It's got some decent animation. Like, that's one of the ones that's directed by Ishidate Taichi, which at this point I've like become very familiar with. Like, okay, if there's an episode that's got a lot of action, they're going to give it to him, because they also give part 4 to him, which is the one with the big fight scene with Yuki and Asakura. And so there's some good animation that Ishidate Taichi does in that big fight with the weird ant monster or whatever. That's cool. But overall, that episode's kind of whatever. I think the most I got out of it was I kind of laughed when Koizumi he's got his like magic ball he makes. It's the first time you see his powers, and he like spikes it. And the first time he does it, he yells out Fumofu. And the second time he does it, He yells out The Second Raid, which are the subtitles of the 2 Full Metal Panic seasons that fucking KyoAni made. And it's so random and pointless, but it's very funny.
Yeah, and I liked that gag a lot. But I am like, and I enjoyed the episode in so much as it was throwing a lot of stuff I didn't know yet at me, and I thought that was interesting. I do imagine in chronological order, where this is 3 episodes after Melancholy Part 6, this would just be kind of a pretty boring rehash of things you already know about the enclosed spaces without the emotional hook that Melancholy Part 6 has, which is that central relationship. This doesn't have any sort of emotional hook to it.
Yeah, and it's one that I think when you, on rewatching the show, when you already know all the stuff, it's just like, there's not really anything like interesting to be gained from it. I think this is one where, like, if you didn't do the shuffle order, I just don't even think you'd make the episode at all. I just think it's like, I don't know if the short story is more interesting in some ways. I mean, there's some stuff like at the very end, you get like a little bit of a nice kind of like closer with Yuki, where, you know, like I think that's the one where Kyoto wonders, like, does she ever feel lonely waiting in this room? It's like you get a little like nuggets here and there, but not much. Really, the interesting episode from this stretch is definitely Remote Island Part 2, where, you know, you get to sort of deal with the fallout from this murder that has occurred. This is also where we should point out that this one has some fun vocal cameos, because the 3 male like guest stars of these episodes, the butler and like the 2 guys, are Kazuhiko Inoue, who's like Kakashi from Naruto. He plays the guy who gets murdered. Akio Otsuka is the butler, and Toshiyuki Morikawa, who's like Leon in Resident Evil 4. He's Sephiroth. He's the guy who's suspected to be the murderer, which, from what I understand, the reason those 3 were cast is because they're particularly well known for a lot of their like live action dubs, and like they're meant to feel like, and I think you can tell from the character designs, like they're meant to be like some guys that would show up in a random like American movie you would watch at the Japanese theater or whatever with a Japanese dub. Like, that's what the vibe is supposed to be, and I think that stuff is very... I like that. Like, that whole side of the murder mystery I enjoy, when they kind of play with the tropes and they play with like the weird kind of texture of it. You've got a very bizarre sequence with like the character with Heidi coming up with her theory that is done with like rotoscoped live action footage.
I can tell you what it is. I believe what it is it's live action footage that has been solarized, which is a process where you take the this can happen accidentally to film, and it's how it was discovered, but it's where you take film basically and you overexpose it until you're left with basically just the line work. This is also a technique that was heavily used in the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings.
Because that was my reference point, was like, that's the weird orc shit in that movie. Yeah.
Because if you know the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, a lot of that movie is rotoscoped, but a lot of that movie, they didn't have a lot of money, so some of it is just live action footage solarized, because if you solarize it, it sort of looks rotoscoped, because the outlines on shapes become very bold and heavy, and so it would be a way to make it match the rotoscoping of the rest of the movie without having to physically animate it, and that's what they're doing here, and it looks, I think that it's solarized and then it is tinted. Some of it's red, some of it's yellow, but I think it looks cool as shit. I really like it.
Yeah, it looks great, but like the best part, because this is all, you have this one like really juicy, like very intimate scene between Kyon and Haruhi in the cave, where she gives this theory that is like mostly right, but like the one thing that's wrong is that she forgot which way the body was facing. And then Kyon presents his thing, which is like, no, that's wrong. Like, the body was facing this way. And when Kyon gives his theory, it's just like a children's drawing in crayon. And I love that. I love how that expresses the 2 characters so well. Where Haruhi has this super elaborate, detailed, really vivid, dramatic recreation of the murder. And then in Kyon's world, we like, all that's extra. You know, he doesn't need to imagine that much. He's just like, no, it's just a stick man and he's fallen on the ground. Like, that's all I need to do to visualize realize the murder and what actually happened. And it's such a great visual metaphor for the thought processes of these two people.
It's very good. I laughed very hard when we saw the crayon drawing, which is just wonderful. Yeah, it's a very fun episode. It's not particularly substantive, but it is very fun.
Yeah, it's just incredibly well directed as well. This one was directed by Tomoe Adatani, who is the woman who eventually she went on to work at Nintendo, and she did a bunch of the good episodes we've seen of our other shows so far. There's just a lot of fun stuff. Like, there's after Kyon pretends to be the killer, they do draw him as the sort of like generic killer in the Detective Conan series or Case Closed, where like when they do a like theory of this is what happened, it's just this like black silhouette man, and it's kind of like a meme, and so I love that they just draw him as that for a little bit before they reveal it's all a ruse. And then there's one sequence that is so bizarre at the end of the episode. I don't know what the point of it is, but it's just very entrancing, where Kyon and Koizumi are on the boat and they're talking to each other about like what actually happened. And while they're talking, you just get this slow zoom in on Koizumi's face as he has this like very detailed, like very sharp glare that he's giving to the back of Kyo's neck. And you get this like cut back and forth. It's slowly zooming in every time it cuts back and forth until eventually it zooms in really close on Kyo's neck. And there's a mole with a hair growing out of it. And Koizumi's like staring at that. And then eventually he averts his gaze. And it's like, it never comes up. It's not addressed. It doesn't seem relevant in a contextual sense to what they're talking about. It's just this very weird particular detail that is like something that like it would be weird if you saw it in a live action movie. It's especially weird in anime because it's like, because you had to just totally invent that off the top of your head. Like, I don't know if there's something in the light novel that like sort of like gestures towards like why they're showing that or not. Like if there's like a weird representation of that's what Koizumi was doing. I have no idea. I haven't read the light novel here. But like if you're doing this in live action, maybe it would be a thing that I think you could see like someone coming up with on the set, like let's shoot this scene this way and kind of come with that. It has like a very kind of like on like set sort of like springs to the top of your mind kind of energy to it. But this is anime. Obviously they had to like storyboard and plan and invent this whole thing of him staring at a hairy mole on the back of Kyon's neck. It's very weird, but it's like the most Haruhi thing about the whole episode.
Absolutely. That one definitely just directorially kind of a masterwork.
Yeah, it's
but
yeah,
not as much of a masterwork.
Oh god.
As we could do a whole podcast on this next episode. Episode 9/episode 28 in the overall run. Yes. I do love the idea of just plop in the middle of the season, go to the final episode on the Blu-ray set. It's insane. Someday in the Rain. I think this is one of the best episodes of anime ever made. And I had this weird journey with it where the whole point of this episode is that it is a super boring, mundane day in the life where nothing happens. No big adventure starts. Nothing fantastic happens. It's about Kyon going and getting a heater 2 train stops away and bringing it back while Haruhi is making Mikuru dress up and Yuki is reading a book and just normal shit. And then at the end, they walk home together in the rain. And I just vividly remember how I was watching this episode, where I was on my couch and I'd been watching a couple of these episodes in a row, and I'd slumped down from sitting up straight to like being kind of on my side to I think I was like lying down on my side for about the first half of this episode. And I was watching it very much in the position of like some of the characters in the episode of just looking like I was very bored. And I was like, this episode's really interesting. You get to that extremely long shot of Yuki that we're going to talk about where you have in your notes the exact timestamps of how long it is, because I do too. And I had to time it as well, and we'll talk about that. But it was even after that moment where I was writing about that and I was realizing it, and then I think it just hit me, oh, we're past the act break. This is the episode. This is not set up for something else. And I just wrote down, this is a stupendous episode of television in my notes, and I have nothing else in my notes. Because it is so, I think, formally interesting. I love how beautiful it is in its blandness. I love the slowness of it. My other only note that I added after the fact is it's like what would happen if the famed Taiwanese director Tsai Ming Liang made an episode of anime. It's absolutely that. If you know his movies like Viva l'Amour or Days or Stray Dogs, it is very much that. We're just going to sit with people in their environment for a while. I truly do think this is like one of my favorite episodes of anime I've ever seen.
Yeah, and I'm 100% with you. And it has been, this is my favorite episode of Haruhi. It's one of my favorite episodes of anime. It has been since I watched this show. And again, the way I originally saw it, at this point, I had switched over to chronological order. So I saw it in context as it being the last episode. And I love it as a last episode. Like, I think it works great in this kind of like middle point in the season as well with what it does with the broadcast order. But I also love this, like, how plain and calm and normal everything is, and that just being the note you kind of leave off on before you go to the movie, because this is like set basically a little bit before the disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi happens. I think it's just like it works so well in that placement as well. But yeah, it's an incredible episode. So a couple of things with it. So this one's directed by Kitanohara Noriyuki. This is the episode that if you go back to the Kanon podcast we did, I talked about for episode 3 of Kanon, which is one of the first episodes in that show that jumped out at me as being particularly well directed. That was the one where I was like, some of the scenes at the end of that of the main character and Ayu walking around in the snow, like with the store and stuff. There were some of those scenes that kind of reminded me of the end of Someday in the Rain with Kyon and Haruhi walking home together. And I was just like, there's something about this episode that reminds me of Someday in the Rain. And I looked it up and it was the same with the director. I'm like, oh, that makes perfect sense. So it's that director. He's done just a bunch of the great episodes we've watched. And then this is the one that's written by Tanigawa, the light novel author. And so this is the only episode that is not based on anything from the light novels. And specifically, Tanigawa wanted to write an episode of the anime. And his idea was he wanted to write an episode that you couldn't really do in the books, right? Which makes sense, right? The whole concept of Someday in the Rain is like that. It is something that most of it is just you observing something from an objective third person point of view of like the cameras. While it's not like you're looking at literal security camera footage, most of the cameras feel physically placed in the environment, and the camera angles chosen are done in such a way to feel physically there is a camera here, and you're like voyeuristically looking through that camera, right? So like the position of the camera in the corner, either corner of the SOS Brigade room, and there are some really interesting cuts that break your like 180-degree rule because you're going to either corner, and it works because of the positioning and the framing of the full room, and you get the spatial orientation. And then you also have the camera that's like in between the books that Yuki has that feels physically there because of the books framing it on the either end in the foreground. And then there's just a bunch of other shots that are like through windows that aren't framed quite perfectly. So characters are kind of blocked by window panes in interesting ways that makes it feel very sort of like voyeuristic and very almost like improvised in the way it's filmed. That it's like, this is just footage that exists in this place, which obviously is particularly interesting in animation because you have to invent all of that, right? It's like one thing for a live action production to do this. An anime production has to you can't put a camera between two books in anime. You have to think through that idea and figure out how do you draw this scene to make it feel like a camera is actually physically placed on this bookshelf, right? And so a lot of that idea of the concept of the episode came from Tanigawa, the author, trying to sort of like experiment with what would it, because he had never written, as far as I can tell in his credits at this point, he'd never written an anime thing before. And he wanted to try to write something that could only be expressed through like a visual medium. And I think that's just like so cool. And it's exactly the way you would get something weird and experimental like this, is someone intentionally trying to push the boundaries of what they can express with their writing craft in a medium that they're not actually used to. And trying to do something that, like, I don't even know what it would be like to try to write a short story of Someday in the Rain. It would just be a fundamentally different thing to express the ideas of the story in literature as opposed to film. But yes, like some of that is just in the DNA of what makes this episode so cool.
Absolutely. And a lot of what you're talking about with the camera work, that is the kind of Tsai Ming Liang thing. It's durational cinema. It's now there's kind of the term for it is slow cinema, but like Tsai Ming Liang's films literally have 10 to 15 minute to 20 minute shots in them where the camera is planted at a fairly neutral position, pretty wide angles, and we're seeing stuff sort of happen in the background. This episode has a lot of humor to it, which is what I love. Mm-hmm. Like the signature shot of this episode is there's two of them broken with one little moment in the middle, but overall it's about 3.5 minutes of Yuki sitting in the club room reading from this like big, it's very much like a security camera angle because you're up in the corner of the room and you're just watching her read. She turns the page every so often and you're hearing all these crazy things from another club down the hall as they're they're like playing around. And that's, I think, both very mundane and beautiful, but also extremely funny. You have the recurring series of shots of Haruhi trying to undress Mikuru while Yuki is standing at the bookshelf and placing books to censor the image, even though I don't know. And I love this sense that Yuki kind of knows what she's doing, like she's being watched by the audience almost, you know?
Well, because there is, and I put it in my screenshots for this episode, there is the last moment of that sequence, because they do that joke a couple of times, and the last one, she turns and looks directly into the camera, and then that's when it cuts to black, and then comes back up for the part B, basically, of the episode. But yeah, so it is like, I feel like you get the sense that like Yuki is aware of the cameras and is aware of being watched, and yes, and perhaps she is intentionally doing the censoring. Which my favorite one is the one where it's like Mikuru gets it's less like the censored, and it's when she pulls back the book and it's just revealed that Mikuru is already in her nurse outfit, and it's just like it's such a good little visual gag.
All of it though, it's this is such a rare thing to do with animation, you know,
yes.
Like an animation can be experimental in all sorts of ways, but the way experimental animation manifests itself is often through speed, not through duration. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of experimental animation is like on the vein of almost like, you know, flicker films and movies that have a lot of images coming at you very fast and are doing stuff with that. And this is the opposite. This is slowing down, being durational. And again, those impulses are there in all of Suzumiya Haruhi. There's some of that in the very first episode. They're littered throughout. Clearly that is something on KyoAni's hive mind in this show, but it is like most fully expressed here because there is no other hook. There is no other like grand sci-fi idea going on here. This could be an episode in a lot of... They could do this episode with a lot of their other shows, just in terms of the plot information, right? And I think that is what makes it just so immensely special, is seeing these kinds of things that, as you say, definitely have a history in live action filmmaking and have a certain valence there, and adapting them to animation and doing them with this aesthetic that they've meticulously built up, really investing in that sort of slightly more realist aesthetic that they've gone for with this show versus some other kinds of series. And it's amazing. It feels like you're living in the world for 20 minutes. It is so beautiful. It is the perfect episode to be watching on like a Sunday afternoon laying on your couch. I don't know what to say, because it is like active boredom, and I love that about it. This is the kind of thing I didn't like when I was 10 years younger, maybe, but now it is my favorite thing in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just remember, like, this episode just stands out so much in my memory when I originally watched it, which would have been maybe about 10 years ago. And I just remember it, like, kind of, like, challenging me in a way I had not seen something quite like this at that point. You know, like, because this is something that when we eventually, you know, from my perspective, originally watched it, when we eventually did Twin Peaks: Return, right? And that show came out, and we watched that, and we did a podcast series on each episode of that as it was airing. Like, Twin Peaks: The Return has a lot of Someday in the Rain fucking energy in there. And that was one of my main comparison points in my own head. Obviously, I don't think I ever talked about it on that podcast because you hadn't seen the show. But, like, you know, some of, like, the weird long takes in Twin Peaks: The Return of, like, a character sweeping up the floor was like, this is giving me the same, like, cool, weird vibes of just watching Yuki sit in this room for fucking 3 minutes just turning a book. And it's great. And there's just, like, a lot of, like, little things that I think the episode does to make that, like, effective. Like, one very small detail, but it's one that just, like, I don't know, it's so sumptuous in kind of a geographic sense or geometric sense is, you know, in the SOS Brigade office is one that we know very well. This is like, we've talked about this before in our anime episodes, where you have these kind of like anime sets of these rooms, of these places you revisit, and you have like these sort of common backgrounds we use, right? This is very much like the club room in Clannad. And you know very well that the long table that the SOS Brigade has in their room is like perpendicular to the door. And so that, you know, it's like you come in and you can see the long end of the table stretching down to perpendicular to the other end of the room. And that's what it is at the beginning of the episode. But then once Kyon leaves, Haruhi and Koizumi and Mikuru start doing their whole thing in the room. And to do that, they've shifted the table so that it's like at an off angle. and it looks kind of weird. And then you get the camera shot that is the Yuki shot, and then you see that has now moved the table, so the table is now perpendicular to your shot in the camera. And there's something about that makes the shot, I think, geometrically, the shapes in the shot are like much more sort of like engaging, and it's like very pleasant to look at. Just like the framing and the shapes of everything, and all the different like kind of squares and rectangles that exist in that, and that this one object is like slightly off in that way. It's so good.
In film studies, we would say they've turned that table into one of the leading lines of the image, because your eyesight is directed in diagonals in that shot, where it's all, even though the room is not diagonal from the position we are in, we're seeing it in such a way that the bookshelf on the right, the table in the middle, and the stuff on the wall looks like it's at a weird sort of diagonal angle to us. And that's also like the artistry of it. A camera will naturally do that if you put the right lens on it and put it in a space. There's nothing. They had to fucking draw this, and that's like it's a simple shot in so much as there isn't a lot of like key animation and in betweens to do in that shot, right? But the actual perspective of it is incredibly accomplished. That's the KyoAni touch right there, absolutely. You know, just in a different way than we usually see it manifested. And this episode, that's like the standout shot because we look at it for 3 minutes. But there's plenty of others that are doing similar kinds of things, I think, in terms of how they're doing photographic techniques through drawings, which is hard to do. It's crazy.
Yeah, and it's just so compelling, just like to visually look at. I mean, it's like it's why you can just sort of like rest on that shot for such a long time, and then also enjoy all like the voice acting of what like I have to imagine is probably mostly ad-libbed, because it has this very sort of like seat of your pants energy, and you can tell that some of those voice actors, like in particular, you can really clearly hear that one of them is Minoru Shiraishi, who plays Tanigawa, one of Kyon's buddies. And Minoru Shiraishi is like one of like the KyoAni regular actors. We'll see him again as like Sakamoto and Nichijou. He was in like every episode of Clannad, but as like Boy A, you know, like he was just like he's in a lot of KyoAni shows like that. And so you kind of hear like, oh, these are some like the KyoAni regulars that kind of just play a lot of like the background students and shows and stuff like that. And it just kind of feels like they're kind of vamping in the background while you're just watching this shot of Yuki sitting there turning the book, and you watch it for 2 minutes straight, totally uninterrupted. You get one like 5-second shot of Kyon sitting in the train, which like is so startling when it happens, because you also get the noise of the train because everything else was so quiet and moody in the Yuki's room, and then you're like, here's Kyon. And then I love it after that you cut back and it's like another minute of Yuki, right? It's not, they don't break it and then it's like it quickly moves on. They break it and then you're in for another long sustained shot. It's so well done. Like it's that kind of thing where while it seems simple conceptually, and it'd be like, well, anyone could do this, like to actually pull it off and make it like compelling and add just the right amount of friction in the right places and like just sustain it for the exact right amount of time. You know that they must have thought and worked and planned a long time to figure out exactly how long and how much time and how to frame everything in that sequence. Because it's like, yes, you're being able to reuse probably the same animation of her flipping the book page and all that kind of stuff. Like there's a lot of work that gets saved by you doing this, but like but these are all like really talented and committed artists. Wherever you're saving work in one element, you're now applying that work in something else that's going on. So you know that they spent so much energy to figure out exactly how to make this stuff as compelling as it is.
Yes, I desperately want to see the storyboards of this episode. I want to know, what does the Yuki shot look like on a storyboard page? Is it just one panel and then a big arrow down the page, like just continue this for a while? Like, is it just like an arrow down the page and then an arrow down another page and another and then cutting to the train and then another repeat of the arrow? How did they draw that? That's so funny to me to try to imagine the storyboard version of this.
Yeah, there aren't any storyboards in the visual fan book for this one, unlike Clannad, which is a bummer. It would be fascinating to find them. But like, so we've talked a lot about like kind of the avant-garde and weird experiential nature of Someday in the Rain, but it isn't totally non-narrative. Like there is some like, I think, good narrative stuff that happens here, particularly with the characters. This is where something we haven't talked about much yet, but is one of my favorite parts of the show, and you're really starting to get into it by this point, is the really quiet but very compelling relationship between Kyon and Yuki, where that's my favorite relationship in the series, and Yuki is probably my favorite character in Haruhi, because there's something about what this episode does to display that kind of simple camaraderie that these two people have. Is Yuki a person, like information android humanoid interface or whatever she calls herself, but right, the weird entity that Yuki is, and how much like humanity does she have is kind of like an open question for a lot of this series. But you have this whole big sequence at the beginning of the episode after Kyon leaves, where it's Mikuru and Haruhi and all of them in the room messing around, and Yuki is in the room with them, but she's not participating in it, right? And so even though they're technically sharing the space, like you so feel that like Yuki is in a completely different world than these other characters, and that like they don't even really acknowledge her presence. And then you get that really, really long sequence of Yuki in the room by herself. And then eventually Kyon comes in. And when Kyon comes in, just in like very subtle ways, you feel how much he exists in the same space as her. You've like it's not like when Haruhi was in the room. Like there is like a simpatico nature about these two characters, and that they both like this sort of calm, peaceful, quiet energy and just being able to exist next to each other. And the camera kind of gets to break some of that angle. It gets to come in tight, and they get to kind of feel like they share the same space with each other. They don't really talk, but Kyon sort of, he takes a little nap on the table, and I love that. You then get this little moment where Yuki closes the book and stands up, and then it fades to black. It comes back up. Kyon has that cardigan over his shoulders, which like it immediately implies, oh, Yuki must have put her cardigan over Kyon, and that is like a small thing but a huge thing, right? The idea that Yuki, this like humanoid interface character thing, would go out of her way to show this simple little piece of kindness to someone is like a massive revelation for Yuki. Then you realize, oh, it's Haruhi has done it, and if Haruhi did it, that's more normal. That's a classic tsundere. Every tsundere character has done that shit in a show. But I love that then she like takes it off of him, be like, give me my cardigan back, and there's another one underneath there, and Yuki actually did put her cardigan on his shoulders. And it's like, what a great like little back and forth, a little moment, which is really kind of like, I think like what the episode is ultimately building up to, is this little moment that you don't even fully see, but you just see all the build up to of that Yuki, when she got up to leave, she saw that Kyon was sleeping in the club room, and it's fairly cold, even with the heater, and she put her cardigan on his shoulders and left. And it's like that little piece of human affection she shows to him is so huge for that character, and it's really important to set up like their relationship that you then go into with episode 4, where you see that she risks her existence to save him, and then all the stuff at the end of the series where she like bets on him to be able to solve the problem at the end. Like there's something about that quiet trust between these two people I love so much. And Someday in the Rain, in its own quiet, weird way, is completely about exploring that dynamic.
Absolutely. That's all there. And then I think also this is one of the things that also just works about this is that it does really work in any order. It's like an episode that works equally well in chronological or in this shuffle order. And part of that is the Haruhi side of it is an episode about Haruhi being fundamentally okay with boredom now. She is still Haruhi. She is still dressing up Mikuru, and there's the whole sequence also that is on the like camcorder where they're playing in the gym, and she's trying to get Mikuru to do the baton twirl and all of that, which is very funny. But like that's pretty harmless stuff. They're just having fun. She makes Kyon go get the furnace and all of that, or the oven, and that's all very funny. But overall, like, she's not threatening to end the world. There's no other bigger emotional turmoil. And you go from that, it's episode 9, and then episode 10 is Melancholy Part 4, which is where the title comes from, because that's when her melancholy sets in, because she is so bored. And I think that's when you go, the wheels start to turn and you realize, oh, that's the arc of this show, is Haruhi being comfortable in her skin and in this world now. And so that juxtaposition is really smart. But also, it's the perfect finale to the series on what you're talking about with Yuki, what you're talking about with Haruhi, all of this. It really does work equally well in the Season 1 configuration or the Season 2 configuration. I know I haven't seen it in the Season 2 configuration yet, but I can do the imagining, and I'm excited to see it again in that order. Yeah,
it's just an absolute masterpiece episode, and then it ends with like I think a very iconic little moment for Haruhi where she runs away with the umbrella, turns around and does the like sticks her tongue out into camera, which is another thing that like when that's your last, that's like the perfect last shot for the Haruhi series. That's like it's one of the things that makes it work really well as a finale, as well as that little moment that just sticks out in my head so well whenever I think about this show.
Yeah. Then I already talked about it a little bit, but we have
Yeah.
Melancholy Part 4, which also, as you say, has a lot of stuff with Yuki.
Yes, this is the big action one, right? This is the other one directed by Ishidate Taichi, because we know you got to get some action, you got to pull him out, because he fucking loves it. And there's, like, the action in this, this is not a very action-focused series, obviously. You don't have a lot of, like, fight scenes or whatever, so it's all basically contained here. And it kind of feels like a shame that I wish that there were some more whacked-out fight scenes in this series, because it looks so cool, because it takes place in this, like, totally weird, abstract place, because it's two people made out of information, right? The idea of Yuki and Asakura is they're both like these, like, interhumanoid interfaces for this weird information being that is like some sort of alien data entity. And so they get to fight in this weird abstract space and are creating weird objects and shit like that to fight each other. And it looks rad as shit. I don't have like a super intellectual take on it or anything. It's just, man, this shit looks cool.
Yeah, it's the big action episode, as you say. It is Ishidate Taichi totally showing off. It's one of several episodes this show, and every KyoAni show does this that we've seen so far, where the show just swerves out of its lane for an episode to do something crazy. This one is great. Obviously, the standout one in this series is Live Alive, which we'll get to in a minute. But the baseball one as well, a little bit. Although, as we know, KyoAni has a lot of experience drawing baseball at this point. So
yes, and while I do like the baseball episode of Haruhi, it's not as good as the baseball episode of Clannad After Story. That's still, if we're making our ranking of KyoAni baseball episodes, that one's still number one.
Absolutely. That's an easy one. But you go from this to the Day of Sagittarius and Live Alive. And I do love that if you watch this in this order, you get like episodes 28, 27, 26, the last three of the overall chronology, completely backwards. And they're like, there's no real reason they have to do Day of Sagittarius before Live Alive, other than I think Live Alive, throws you into the final two Melancholy episodes better. But these are both phenomenal, like, one-off episodes, and I love them, and I also love that they're backwards, and it's just great.
Yeah, Days of Sagittarius is like just a totally super fun episode, right? This is the one episode we've got the season directed by Takimoto Yasuhiro, so obviously the direction is fantastic. Also really interesting is that this is the episode written by Shoji Gato, who is the author of Full Metal Panic, which is a mecha series, so it makes sense that like they pull in the mecha guy. And I'm pretty sure that he and Tanigawa Nagaru, the author of Haruhi, are friends. And that's kind of like how that connection was made. And then obviously you also have the KyoAni connection. So he got pulled in to do this one. It is it is still an adaptation of a section for the light novel. But, you got to have some authentic mech shit. And everything, it's just... if you've ever watched Gundam and Macross and all that kind of stuff, there's just so many little weird references in the Day of Sagittarius. And I just love seeing all the ships. Like, I took screenshots for my notes of all the different establishing shots they do for each of the different fleets. And you get to see the kind of command ships for all the characters. And, like... I love that Mikuru's crew are all these, they're called the Neko Man. These are weird little sketchy drawings that apparently Hiro Aya did on her scripts that they started doing for like putting in some of the marketing of the show. And so they just made all these goofy little cartoon cat dudes are Mikuru's crew. And then Nagato, it's just like 100 Nagatos. They're just all piloting her ship. It's so good. And just all the outfits that characters get to wear. The bad guys are some weird sort of like mix of, they both look like they're part the aliens from Macross and part the Zeon from Mobile Suit Gundam. It's just all that stuff is incredibly fun.
I love it. It's adorable. I love all the stuff with Yuki typing crazily, which is somehow like really excitingly animated. All of that's crazy. Here's my favorite slick little thing they do in this episode, though, is the music is like this big orchestral sweeping like mecha music in the main stuff where we're seeing like sort of the imagined video game that they're playing. But then when it cuts back to the club room and they're on their little laptops, it's perfectly matched to a chiptune version of it in 8 bits. That is sick. I fucking love it.
Yeah, it's great. And just the whole arc of the episode, this is another Yuki-focused one of her, like, starting out not knowing how to use a computer. One of my favorite jokes of this whole show is Kyon being like, well, at least we've got her. And he looks up and she's just holding the mouse vertically in the air, waving it around, not knowing what to do with it. He's like, oh, we're fucked, aren't we? And then, of course, eventually she learns and figures out how to do the computer stuff. I love that slow reveal of, like, she's really actually having a really fun time with it in her own weird way. And then... again, with that weird trust that she and Kyon have, where he gives gives her this command of don't cheat, let's win normally. And then, of course, you find out that the bad guys, or the commuter club, I guess they're not bad guys. They got fucked over pretty bad by Haruhi. I'm fairly sympathetic for their attempt to try to get their fucking computer back, honestly,
yes.
even if they got to cheat to do it. But they're cheating, and Yuki reveals that, and that sort of moment of her asking for Kyon's permission to hit the enter key to, fix it, and him saying yes, and then they, of course, wipe them out, win the day. And I love how, sort of over the top, all of the animation and footage you get of the giant fleet battles, and at the very end, they've won and blown up the big ship. There's a massive explosion, and then it just cuts to Yuki looking at her screen. It just says, "You win" on it. It's cutting back to this very plain little scene when you've just been inside of this giant, massive space battle. Is a lot of fun.
Yes, Sean. And part of that is also because the game they're playing is this weird little computer game that these hobbyists at high school made. It's not super technologically advanced. So all of that is in their imagination, and I love how extra it all is.
Yes. And then, of course, since we're the Weekly Suit Gundam people, we have to point out that there is just a straight-up Gundam reference where Haruhi just shouts out, well, then send out the Gundam! But they bleep out the word Gundam, and they have this hilarious, super heavily mosaiced image of, what obviously is the Gundam. And you get Sugita going, "Ikimasu! Te muri!" Which is one of my favorite line deliveries by Sugita, where he's doing a little bit of an Amuro impression. It feels like this episode is the last episode they give themselves, just this is we're playing with this episode. There's no big, huge things that happen. There's a little bit of character resonance here and there with some of the character relationships, but it's just an episode about having fun as you're getting into the home stretch of the show.
Yep. And then you have Live Alive, which is definitely this show's biggest let's swerve wildly out of this show's lane to show the fuck off episode, because all of the, in this case, just directly previewing K-On! From a couple years later, of let's do some amazing rock band animation. And boy howdy, they do some amazing rock band animation. But I also think this episode is just an all-around great mood piece, where you've got Kyon just sort of wandering the halls of the festival for the first half before it locks in the second, where he realizes Haruhi has done this cool thing and watches this full performance. It's great.
Yeah, this is one where I think you really can feel, and it feels so sort of present, the choice of Kyon's POV, because obviously it's been true throughout the whole show. But if you've ever watched an anime, you've seen a cultural festival episode, so it's this is a very familiar tropey kind of archetype for an episode, but I've never seen one that's so fully committed to staying in the main character's POV for the whole thing, because these are usually these are your big episodes where you have every single character is involved and every character is running one of their little maid cafes or doing a haunted house or whatever it is. And here you just are so in Kyon's shoes as he's walking around and just kind of observing the school festival for the full first half. One thing I think is really impressive about this episode is also just how varied all the background characters are. There's just from a workload perspective, there are so many unique looking characters. Usually in an episode like this that you've got a bunch of crowds, you maybe have a couple of people in the front line of the crowd that look a little unique, and then you've got either very generic characters that are just characters in school uniforms, or you just have more kind of representative shapes that aren't meant to look like actual people but convey the idea of a big crowd. And this is no, every shot, and I took a bunch of screenshots just to show it because I was so impressed going back through this. There's so many shots where you have all these really unique character designs that look really good and super well designed that only show up in the background of one image, and that's it. And it's I think it just adds to that kind of feel of the authenticity of an actual festival full of all these people that Kyon is wandering around. And I think the fact that everyone else looks unique, every other character looks like they could be having their own little school festival episode going on. And I think it highlights how lonely Kyon is for the whole first half, because he's not with any of his buddies from the SOS Brigade, and he's just walking around in this world full of other unique people, kind of stopping in and seeing Yuki at her booth, seeing Mikuru doing the waitress stuff, or the waitress maid stuff, but not really kind of having a connection with anybody while he's wandering around the festival.
Yeah. And I also, I'm trying to keep the chronology straight in my head. Knowing that KyoAni would go on to do two massive shows, K-On! And Sound Euphonium, that are about the performance of music and are basically the greatest like animation examples of that ever. Is this basically the first time they did a big episode about this kind of thing? Because it's so clearly like they need to do more of this, was my feeling watching this. And then I look over at my shelf and I'm like, I got K-On! Over there. They do a lot more of this.
Yes, and it is the first time they did this. And it's so funny because you do have, like, up in when Kyon goes to the big kind of like band hall or whatever, they have the school band playing. It just does look like Sound Euphonium Season 0 or something. Like, I took one of the screenshots of it just because it made me laugh. And obviously, Sound Euphonium, not only did Sound Euphonium, the anime, not exist, the light novel that it's based on hadn't even been fucking written yet. So, like, there was no Sound Euphonium anywhere out there. This is just, it just sort of, it's a representation of a high school brass band. It's just very funny. And then when the band that plays that Haruhi and Yuki become part of at the end, when they're introduced, they're part of the Keionbu, or the Light Music Club, which is the same kind of music club that Keion, the manga/anime, gets its name from. So it is just like weirdly prescient that KyoAni did this episode, because it does have your Sound Euphonium and Keion stuff kind of in there somehow.
Well, and from like clips and scenes of I've never seen in full K-On! Or Sound Euphonium, but I've seen clips and stuff. And like a lot of the techniques that become really central there, of like the way they kind of do some different stuff with like focus pulling on the camera and getting in on weird angles, and like the shots where they really lovingly watch the fingers going over the guitar, and you're like, how at 24 frames per second of animation did you possibly do this? It synced so perfectly. It's very much a preview of things to come.
Oh yeah, like if you've ever seen like any of the like ending themes of K-On!, like it is very similar to the God Knows performance in this episode. Absolutely.
And the songs rock.
Yes, the songs kick ass. I mean, this is where I haven't had enough time to watch through all of the bonus features on the Funimation Blu-ray set, which like is awesome that they have a lot of bonus stuff on that last disc, and it's very rare that in English releases for anime that you get any of the special features. And some of it is pretty plain. It's mostly a lot of just sort of like very plainly represented behind the scenes footage. But one of the things I have seen is they have the sessions where Hirano Aya, the voice actress for Haruhi, records the second song from the set, which I think she recorded before she did God Knows, because they wanted her to get kind of like good at it, because they want God Knows is obviously the one that's the actual featured song you get the full 3-minute plus performance of, that is fully animated, which is fucking glorious and extremely like luxuriant in terms of a production thing. So they wanted her to record that one second. And it's really cool to see the process of them recording it. It is basically one of the first things she recorded for the show, because they wanted to have that done, because they used that footage of her doing the recording as reference for when they animated Haruhi performing it, which is rare in anime, right? Usually you would have all the animation done first, and then you have the voice actors voice act over it for this specific thing. And this is where you feel how strong their pre-production was for this show and how much they planned ahead, that they had enough of that like foresight to know, let's make sure we record this. Before she had done any dialogue, she did the recording for those 2 songs, which were written for this show. And it's really impressive. And it's also just like impressive to see the process of them recording it, because it made me appreciate more when I watched it how well they capture the feeling of a live musical performance, that it doesn't sound like a studio song when Haruhi is singing. Like, it sounds like she has the energy of someone actually singing live on the stage. It's not like absolutely perfect. Like her voice is a little bit hoarse in places and stuff like that. And, they worked really hard to try to make it feel that way. And it comes across so well in the finished product. And then that like performance and the music and all that combined with how good the animation is, and how just like obviously on the singing, you have some of those shots that are like crazy with like how detailed the facial animation is on Haruhi as she sings. The fingering of the guitar for Yuki, which is like a guitarist myself, is like so sumptuous looking. It's like, it's just, you could just look at that forever. It's so well done. It is just a very premium version of a musical performance in an anime. It's really fucking good. And this shit was very rare at the time. Like, this was very influential, kind of like Hare Hare Yukai. After Hare Hare Yukai, lots more anime tended to have dances in the ending theme. That became a lot more common. And also, I feel like after Haruhi, you had more of this, let's try to do our big musical performance thing. And obviously, you then have like that entire genre of the school idol anime that just like is that basically as a genre to a certain extent.
Yes. And also, it's just, Aya Hirano, for those who don't know, and we'll talk about her more later, she's a singer first and foremost, not
Yes.
a voice actor. And I mean, she does do voice acting, but like her first career is singing. And like, obviously, if you've got her, you should have her sing in your show. That's just a fucking rule. Even when she was Dende, she was cast as Dende in Dragon Ball for Kai, and they gave Dende a fucking song in Dragon Ball
Yes.
Kai that he did not have in the original, because they had Aya Hirano, and you should. And she's great. And she's truly, I think, not just performing the song, she's performing the character in the song.
Yes.
And all of that, it's just so smooth. And yeah, I had heard about this episode. I will say, I had heard about this episode. I didn't know anything about it. Honestly, I think I thought it was more related to K-On! Because of like it's what it's about. But I'm like, oh, this is actually in Haruhi, and it's near the end. So like clearly they don't stay in a band because the show's almost over. But there you go. It's great.
Yeah, and I do love in the first half of the episode, you do see in the background, like, the events of what leads to Haruhi ending up in the band. It happens in the background of some of the shots, which is fun to look. That's like a good second viewing thing to look for, because there is that one moment where you can see in the background. I think Kyon is saying, like, just want to make sure that nothing weird happens or whatever today. And then in the background, you can see Haruhi in her bunny outfit and Yuki with her maid, like, witch outfit on, running around. And, like, they're running past a hallway out of focus in the back. And it's very funny. So, yeah. And then we've kind of already, in some ways, talked about what this episode is doing narratively for Haruhi. But this is the one where, like, it shows you that kind of culmination of Haruhi's character arc, right? Where she is, as you said earlier in the episode, this is the episode where she is thanked by these people and she doesn't know what to do with it. It's something she's never really experienced being appreciated. And I think this is where you feel most fully that there is this really like amazing side to Haruhi. She is this very skilled person. And if she could just kind of like use that to help people more than to torment them, like she could, do really incredible things. And I think you as an audience feel that, and Kyon feels that so much. And one of the most moving moments in all of this show to me is when Kyon taps his fingers along with the song, which is such a small little movement, but it's like, for Kyon, it's kind of like Yuki putting her cardigan over Kyon's shoulders. Like that little moment of him kind of vibing along with the music says so much about how much affection he really has for Haruhi and how impressed he is by her, and like why he is continuing to put up with all of her bullshit is because she can do these amazing things too. And it's such a great episode to use as this sort of, here's that future, and then you back up and say, okay, how do we get to that point really?
Which is our final two episodes, the Melancholy Part 5 and 6, which are so good, and Part 6 particularly is so clearly the season finale by every metric, down to it doesn't have the theme song. It has the theme song at the end with the credits over it. It's very clearly has like an epilogue sequence, all of those things. It is very clearly the season finale, but both of these are just tremendous episodes, and I think as much affection as I had for this show going into these last two, I think it really was multiplied by it ends so strong that I think it really ties this season together as something really coherent and beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big like effects of the broadcast order thing is that the impact of these last two episodes are so heightened by this that even if like at the midpoint you're kind of like, is this really working? Like, I don't know. By the time you get to the end, the broadcast order, like, I think you just feel so powerfully the benefit of it. And it's like, as a whole, when you reflect on the season as a whole, you just feel so much more emotionally invested in and emotionally fulfilled by the arc of the Melancholy storyline because of the way they've kind of broken it up and fleshed in all those gaps with all that future information to give this more resonance when you revisit the ending of that original arc.
Yeah, I mean, I think the framing of part 6 of the finale really makes it clear why the season was structured this way, because it's Kyon asking himself, why him? Why is he there? The other people in the SOS Brigade are aliens and espers and all these things. And that's really been the driving question of the season. He's asked himself that before. And you know, I'm teaching an intro to film class right now, and one of the things we talk about when we talk about narrative is distinguishing the difference between story and plot. And we say story is like everything in the universe of the world. You know, I use the example of the original Star Wars. The story of Star Wars also encompasses all 7 seasons of the Clone Wars, because the Clone Wars is mentioned in that movie. But the plot of Star Wars A New Hope is Luke going from the farm to destroying the Death Star, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, there's lots of movies that do this in interesting ways. Citizen Kane, obviously, is a very famous... The story is this linear, a man's life. The plot is this specific search for what was the thing broken about him. And the specific plot of this season is that question. It's Kyon asking sort of why him, and then it is also sort of Haruhi's deal of getting comfortable in her own skin in her life. And this is where the question gets answered. So it kind of has to be where the season ends, because if you answered the question and then kind of just kept going, you'd kind of be missing the forest for the trees. And this really is the climax to all those other stories that we've seen, even if it happened earlier than many of them. And it is just so fulfilling.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also where you get, so in the penultimate episode is where you get the big speech from Haruhi that gives you the kind of framework for, okay, this is how she sees the world, right? And I love this moment where she reflects on and tells Kyon about this little moment of her going to a baseball stadium and seeing a baseball game with her dad, and seeing how many people were there, and her having her mind blown by it and being like, well, Dad, how many people are here? Thinking like, this has to be like everybody in Japan showed up to this baseball game. And he's like, well, there's like 50,000 people because the stadium's full. It's about 50,000. And then she goes home and she does the calculations and stuff and realizes that that's like 1/2000th or whatever it is of like the population of Japan, which is one small country in a giant world. And it's like, it's a very powerful moment. And I love how sort of just small and normal it is. I think everyone can kind of relate to having some kind of moment like this in their development as a person, of realizing I'm not the most important thing in the world. That how could I be? Because I am one person and there are billions of people, right? And all of them have their families and their issues and have gone through all those experiences. And it just gives you that insight into, I think, like this sort of universal struggle that everyone goes through their adolescence, is that sense of like, I think this is one of the reasons why people, as they go into adolescence, have a sense of like meaninglessness, and they kind of struggle with the kind of existentialist style ideas, because when you're like faced with the idea of I'm not that important, like what I do doesn't really matter on a cosmic scale, or like even like if like what I do doesn't really affect the world, it doesn't really affect the country, it doesn't really affect the state I live in, it doesn't really affect the city I live in, it doesn't really affect the town I live in, it might even really affect the school I live in. Like once again to your classroom level, then you're like your actions really sort of start to affect things, right? And so when you think about those different scales in which you exist, and you have to confront the own kind of like relative like meaninglessness of your existence in the scale of everything else, you know, people struggle with what does that mean for who you are and your purpose and what you're trying to do in the world. And I think everyone has to confront those ideas at different points, and most people go through it in their adolescence. And it's that struggle with both your like that kind of egotistical side of a teenager that thinks of themselves as being like the most important thing in the world, and like, you know, they're very self-focused for like some of them just sort of biochemical reasons in their development. You're very self-focused and self-interested, but you also logically are beginning to understand that that doesn't make sense. And you logically and intellectually understand you're not the most important person in the world, even when all of your body chemistry is telling you this is all super important. This like is making me feel so much and feel so strongly that it's like, it must be, there's no way everyone else can feel this way. And you feel that in your body, and your brain is telling you that can't possibly be true, right? And this is like the thing that she is struggling with. And I think it's one of the geniuses of the premise of this series is like taking that and sort of projecting it out as this sort of fantasy element of she is the most important thing in the world, and what does that look like, right? What does it look like when the world is shaped by her fantasies and her dreams and the things that she's trying to pursue, and is held back by the logical restraints she puts herself on, right? The kind of one things Koizumi says in the ending stretch here is that, like, one of the only reasons why the world isn't just shifting based on her every whim is that parts of her logical brain tells her that that's not the way that things could possibly work. And so she's putting the brakes on herself. And so that push and pull of who she is as a person, these two different parts of what she feels and what she knows about the world and what she wants about the world, are constantly bumping up against each other and creating the friction that eventually we see in the conclusion of Melancholy almost threatens the existence of the world, as the thing that she needs Kyon to help her kind of resolve and be comfortable in her own skin and comfortable in the world as it exists. And I think I just love how beautiful that story is and how well I think it understands this kind of young adult genre. And we talked about with like Clannad being very good at understanding that kind of teenage psychology. And I think it's just as true with Haruhi, that these characters really kind of express something that feels very authentic and are exploring very authentic ideas about what it is to be an adolescent.
Yes. And I also think saving this revelation for the end, I think, is really meaningful. I think it's really meaningful to go to the end and know, okay, Haruhi doesn't actually think she's the most important person in the world. She sure the fuck acts like it a lot of the time. She doesn't actually think that. There's like a deep well of anxiety going on here, and that is a big part of it. And, you know, I think you get that sort of skeleton key to unlocking the story in the same episode where you have the formal exposition of what an enclosed space is for the first time. And so you get all of that. So episode 5 really is this, or part 5, which is episode 13, is like this really important linchpin to a lot of parts of the story, but I think it being kept until here is so compelling. And then part 6 being the payoff, it being the payoff not just for these 6 episodes, but all 14 of season 1. So the payoff to both past stories and future stories, where you, the viewer, are taking in other scenes that you've seen between Kyon and Haruhi from other episodes that technically happened later, but you watched first, I think makes it resonate all the more. Like, I'm going to be very curious to see what I feel about these 6, watching them in order for the season 2 episode, because I think these would still be very, very good episodes, but I do think, like, the choices and the movements that Kyon and Haruhi make in that final episode, they're so informed by me seeing other adventures they've had, and a lot of those like status quo slice of lifey things haven't happened yet if you're just following the very plot focused Melancholy episodes, what was in that first light novel, and taking a lot of those more mundane stories, including Someday in the Rain, and having them be narratively preludes to this, I think makes the payoff all the more immense. I mean, God, when you get the final moments of this season, and it is him coming to class, and just that very mundane, now they're back in class again, but he turns behind and sees Haruhi has her hair in the ponytail, and he says, Haruhi, that looks good, and then we kick into the theme song. I wanted to stand up and cheer. It's fucking perfect. And I don't think that moment would hit me as much if it were just episode 6.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, again, it's the thing that makes that broadcast order, like, fully worth it, is that level of impact. And I love so much that, like, what this story boils down to is him grabbing Haruhi by the shoulders and saying that's, like, basically him saying he has a ponytail fetish is more or less what he says, right? He uses the word moe, though, right? He says he has, like, ponytail moe, so he feels moe for girls in ponytails. He says it's like, in that ponytail you had on, which now when you rewatch these episodes, you'll notice when he sees her in the ponytail for the first time in episode 1. But it's like, that ponytail you had on was like, she looked so good, it's a crime, is basically what he says. Yes. I just love, it's so cheesy what he says to her, and then kisses her, and then and then that moment of him not knowing if that was a dream or not, him heading to the school, and him wondering, like, how would I ever even be able to know if it was a dream, and then him opening the door, and then you get the shot of Haruhi sitting at her desk looking out the window with the ponytail. Yeah, it's such a fucking fantastic conclusion.
It's the right ending, and that is, like, looking at, as you say, the production history, and Ishihara, you know, his idea being, okay, but the story has to be the Melancholy. That has to be the ending. It's correct. It's absolutely the correct instinct.
Absolutely. The other big thing I want to talk about in this episode, just because because I don't have a ponytail moe, but I definitely felt moe here, but it was over a text screen, because when Yuki types in, and she like has all this stuff she types into Kyon when he's in the SOS Brigade in the enclosed space, and there's a moment where she says like, "I'm going to bet on you," like is like, "I think you can solve this." And she says, the information entity wants you to survive, and I, as an individual, want you to survive and come back too. And when she says that, that's moe. That's like, oh my god, like weird little robot girl. Her saying that's like, I, as an individual unit, want you to survive and come back to me is like, holy shit, that's love, man. That's the real shit.
I love it. I love you have the Snow White hint from future Mikuru, and then from Yuki you have Sleeping Beauty. And with both of those, I was thinking, is it really going to be as simple as he just needs to kiss her? And then when you get there, I'm like, yes, it is, and that's great. And I like whenever you can kind of take a fairy tale thing and really, like, bring out the power of it through some kind of, like, play on it, which is, I think, what they've done here, where that final kiss feels so big and, like, redemptive, and bigger than any just sort of boy-girl love story. There's so much more going on with it, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, I think Kyon has a long life ahead of him putting up with Haruhi, and she's never going to be totally normal, but it's never going to be a boring life.
Yes, there will be a whole batch of season 2 episodes and a movie, and then like 6 light novel volumes that sadly have not been adapted.
Yes. All right. Do you want to quickly hit on some of these voice actors before we wrap up for today?
Yes. So I think obviously the person who has the biggest load on him in this show is Tomokazu Sugita as Kyon, who of course we've already talked about. He is the main character of Kanon, and he's got a lot of shit he has to say in this show. Because it was interesting. Apparently, so it's like, his stuff is broken down where he's got 3 different things he has to do. He has to obviously do Kyon's dialogue. He then has to do Kyon's internal monologue. He also has the show's narration, which is not the same thing as Kyon's internal monologue, particularly because of the broken order of the chronology stuff. Like, there are times where there is narration in Kyon's voice that knows more than the Kyon in the episode. So, right, like the Kyon in the episode has an internal monologue of him in that moment, but you also have a sort of seemingly future Kyon who is reflecting on these events that narrates to you. And so Sugita has to embody all of those things, and it is like such a sort of wordy performance he has to give. He is just basically doing, for some of those episodes, like episode 1 and 2 of Melancholy, like basically an audiobook version of the fucking light novels. But man, I could listen to Sugita just read a fucking phone book. That guy has the most pleasant voice, and he just so embodies that character completely. And there's the sense of humor and the pace and everything of that, like that narration, it's fucking perfect.
Yeah, I've heard him in a lot of stuff at this point. This is probably my favorite thing I've heard him do, with the asterisk that I have not seen most of Gintama. So, and I know that's his like biggest part.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he's fucking brilliant there. But this is like, it's the kind of voice you need for this, where he can be a little detached and like bland sounding, and then also extremely witty and funny and charismatic, but like dialed just to the right degrees, where I think if you were a degree off in either direction, the character wouldn't work, and if the character doesn't work, the show doesn't work, and it works beautifully.
Yeah, and it's crazy also to think, like, he did this, and then, like, 6 months later, he did Yuichi and the main character in Kanon. It's like, Kyoani was just, like, really riding that Sugita train.
And Kanon, another one where it's just a hard role to do, and, like, I think Sugita... I don't know if Sugita is even, like, the voice that you would first think of for either of those characters reading it on the page. I think it's like really smart casting against because I think both of those, like I think the characters have slightly deeper than voices than I would normally think. He can be like the wit comes in kind of a different direction than you would expect, but it's just perfect. It's exactly what the roles need.
Yeah, then Kyon is my favorite Sugita performance. Like, I really love Gintoki and Gintama as well, but this is, like, when I think of him in, like, his most iconic role, it's definitely Kyon. And one note on Kyon, one thing that I had totally forgotten about this character, is that Kyon isn't actually his name. That's a
Right.
nickname, and we never find out ever what his actual name is, and I fucking love that detail. So I had totally forgotten that his name wasn't Kyon, and we never find out his surname either. Like, you never know. That feels like very much a byproduct of the light novels, right? That since he's the narrative voice, like, it makes sense that you would never... you'd never have a third-person narrator saying, and then Kyon said this. And so it feels like natural that you never find out his name, but it is very funny.
Perfect.
That's just a nickname.
Yes.
Then, of course, you have your other lead here, which is Hirano Aya playing Suzumiya Haruhi, whom we will see her again next week because she also plays the main character Konata in Lucky Star. So we'll have plenty of her. Other of her really big roles, she's Misa in Death Note. You already talked about Jonathan. She is the recasted Dende in Dragon Ball. So everything Kai on, including Super, is all her. She's Lucy, the main character in the Fairy Tail series. And then she also, if you want to get some more Aya and Tomokazu Sugita together, you can watch some Gintama because she plays one of the characters, Nobume Imai, who's more of like a guest star kind of character in Gintama. But yeah, so Hirano, she is like a big sort of, has a huge musical career. She's basically a rock star. Like, you can feel that so much in her voice, and that's like very much the style. It's one of the reasons like Good God Knows sounds so good. And in 2011, she was considered the 5th best-selling voice actress in Japan, according to a source I found, valued at $1.5 million in sales, which was behind Toyosaki Aki, who is the main actress from K-On!, Tamada Yukari, whom we've talked about. This is like the first thing we've watched so far that she is not in for KyoAni. And then Sphere, which is really a group of like 5 voice actresses, and then Mizuki Nana, who is at number 1, which is, of course, because she's also like basically a huge pop star. One thing I want to just mention here, just so I can give people context for it, because if people Google about Hirano Ayash, they will probably find out about this, that there was an incredibly stupid, frustrating controversy that happened around her in 2011 as part of like an extension of the dumb pop idol culture stuff in Japan, where there's basically a kind of sex scandal that occurred where private photos she had were leaked of her showing herself in bed with a member of her band, like presumably them having slept with each other. She was not married or anything. She wasn't cheating on anybody. This was, as far as we could know, just a consensual sexual relationship between 2 adult people that had one of their private photos stolen and leaked online. But because of that dumb idol culture thing, there was like a whole big controversy about it. And so, it's a dumb thing. But if you Google around about it, there are some people who say stupid shit about her because of it. But like, she did nothing wrong, and it's very frustrating that happened. So yeah.
Yeah. But I love her. She's great. She's good in all of these things, and she's obviously an amazing singer. And just this is her most iconic role, right? I mean, this is phenomenal stuff.
Yeah, this is just like a legendary performance. I mean, you have to... It's such a delicate thing to walk that line of making the character sometimes very frustrating and annoying, and sometimes just like you just want to see what the fuck she's going to do next. It's a phenomenal performance. I love her as an actress and singer. Then we've got, for Nagato Yuki, it's played by Chihara Minori, whom... we will see next week as well, because she is also in Lucky Star. She's Iwasaki Minami. She's also going to be in Sound Euphonium, and she's in Violet Evergarden. So she is one of the returning people. She also sings the ending theme to Violet Evergarden, which blew my mind because I did not know that until I was doing research for this episode. I was like, oh... that's that Minori Chihara, because I've listened to that song because I love it on Spotify. I just didn't put it together that it's the same name. I just assumed it was someone else, because you can't tell it's her, obviously, because she's singing the song. But she's a great singer, great voice actress. Bonus fun fact, Chihara... Oh yeah, I forgot. I wrote these notes like 3 weeks ago, so some of this is stuff I've forgotten. I wrote down. Chihara got started with her career in the entertainment industry when she won a contest to be an assistant on Mariko Koda's radio show, Mariko Koda's Game Museum, and that's the voice actress we talked about in Kanon, who plays Nayuki in that show. So that is like a really weird, weird connection that I stumbled on. That's how she got started, is she won a contest and she was on a radio show with Mariko Koda, and then she got in anime stuff, and now she's like a big singer and anime star.
That's awesome. I wouldn't know that side of it just from watching her as Yuki, obviously, because it's a very controlled performance with like this, very kind of meek voice. But she's fucking phenomenal.
Yeah, and Yuki is like a very like against type character for her. She plays much more kind of cutesy characters. Like Nagata Yuki is a very strange like, it's a really great performance. I think it's a smart piece of casting, but it's a very against type kind of casting. Then so Asahina Mikuru, we have voice actress I just love, Goto Yuko, or Gotuza, which is her nickname that she got from Sugita, is Gotuza-sama, because she plays Mikuru, who is like the most adorable character in the world. She is like super tough, and she's like a biker, and she wears like leather and shit, and she's just like an absolute badass. So Sugita called her Gotuza because it sounds like a cool Yakuza name, basically. And she just kicks ass. And I want people to keep that Gotuza-sama thing in the back of your head, because it's going to come up in something in the thing that'll be very fun.
I googled her name, and the first image is a drawing of her as an anime character on a motorbike, and the second image is of her posing next to a cool motorbike and looking like a badass. Yeah. She rocks.
Yeah, she kicks absolute ass. She's in a bunch of really good stuff. She's in the Shuffle series, which is like a visual novel and anime series. She's one of the main characters in Code Geass, Anya Alstrheim. She is Madoka's mom in the Madoka Magica series. She is, if you want to see her in something else, KyoAni, she is Georgie, who is a very funny character that is like this elementary school girl who is really into maids, but actual maid culture, like historical maids. Like it's a very good performance, and that's from Kobayashi-san's Maid Dragon. And then we'll see her have a fun little cameo in Lucky Star. One little note on her, there's something I learned that made sense, because I always thought like there's a long period where she was not in stuff. And when I looked it up, she apparently suffers from an autoimmune disease that meant she basically didn't work from 2012 to 2014. And then after 2014, she has started working again. And now she's like in a bunch of stuff again. But I didn't know that she had medical issues. And that's why she has, like, if you look up her career, she's got a really big break in there. But it's cool that she's back and playing lots of roles again, because she's fucking awesome. Because she's just awesome in the show. I've also listened to some clips from the radio show, the promotional radio show they did for Haruhi, and she's the best on there. She's incredibly funny. Like, she just seems like a really rad person. Yeah. And then we've got Ono Daisuke, whom we've already talked about. He's the main dude in Air, Yukito, he's Koizumi Itsuke in this show. This is like, to me, more so than Yukito in Air, which he did a good job there. This is like a classic Ono Daisuke performance. He's got pretty boy voice, but I love, he's also Sebastian the butler in Black Butler, and it's very much the same kind of, like, there's just enough like weird venom underneath it with Koizumi. Like, you never quite know exactly what Koizumi's deal is. You always feel like he's playing some kind of angle, and you're not totally sure what it is. It's what makes it when he just is like staring at the mole on the back of Kyon's neck. He's just like, what is this fucking dude's deal? And it's just such a well-tuned performance to make you feel there's something really mysterious about this guy.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's one of his best performances. It's because, again, he, like Sugita, has to deliver fucking reams of dialogue at points, and I think he does it with like a little bit of a spring in his step that is part of what brings that character to life, and it's absolutely delightful.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a couple of minor ones I wanted to bring up just because I noticed some fun other actors on the show. So Kyon's sister, his little sister, who is another character, you never find out what her name is. She's just called Kyon's sister in all the credits, which I love. She's voiced by Sayaka Aoki, which if you're a Sonic the Hedgehog fan, you will know her as Cream the Rabbit in all the Sonic the Hedgehog stuff, which is a very similar kind of voice. And I love Kyon's sister. It's like the most adorable it's the character ever. It's so appropriate that she's just a little sister character. She doesn't even have a name, and it's perfect. Then you've got Tsuruya. Tsuruya is Mikuru's like friend in her class that sometimes comes and hangs out. She is voiced by Yuki Matsuoka, who is Orihime in Bleach, and then she's Osaka in Azumanga Daioh, which if you've ever seen Azumanga Daioh, you know that is like one of the greatest comic performances in the history of anime. And I didn't realize it was her because it's a very different voice, but very good. And then I talked about him a little bit already, but Minori Shiraishi is Taniguchi, the tall one of Kyon's buddies, and we are going to get him in Lucky Star. We're also going to get him as Sakamoto the cat in Nichijou, but he is just like in like everything KyoAni around this time, but mostly playing like lots of little background roles, and he also tends to host a lot of the like, here's a little like promotional show we're doing or a radio thing, and he's on a lot of that. So like, just get used to him because again, he plays himself in Lucky Star. He's in basically all the Next On previews. So you're going to get a lot of Minori Shiraishi. You're going to really come to love this dude because I fucking love him. He's got such a plain sounding voice, and it works so well for some of these characters he plays, like Sakamoto and himself in Lucky Star. Obviously, he doesn't like stand out super much in Haruhi because it's not a big role, but I was happy to see him here.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that does it for this episode, Sean. I think we talked about the Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, season 1.
Yes. Yeah, there's still plenty around the corner, so we will take a little bit of a break from Haruhi to kind of refresh the engine, so that way when we watch season 2, it'll be a little bit fresher. So next week, we're going to be covering all things Lucky Star, which is 24 episodes, and the OVA, which you can get this on a Funimation Blu-ray. The Blu-ray's not great quality, Jonathan.
Let me tell the kids about it really quick, just so people know. The problem with the Blu-ray is that it is one. Lucky Star is a standard definition show.
Yes.
So it is an upscale of that. Upscales can be shitty. It's a shitty upscale, and it is in a 1080i transfer. It's interlaced, not progressive. Interlaced is bad. It's also running at 60 hertz. The show is not animated at 60 FPS. So it's not that they've like interpolated frames, but if you can do math, 24 does not divide equally into 60. Bunch of problems there, but the Lucky Star Blu-ray set, in some versions, it's still in print. It's only $24 on Amazon right now, is a combo pack with the DVDs. The DVDs are a totally reasonable 480p, so it is lower resolution, but it is progressive, 24 frames per second. It's not doing any upscaling. Your player will do that without messing it up. Just watch the DVDs. If you have that set, there is another version that is just Blu-ray with a digital copy. Don't get that. You can still find it. It's in print, the Blu-ray plus DVD set. Get that and watch the DVDs, and you're good to go. That's the show as it should look.
Okay, I'm glad that you've done that research. Very good. Have you looked at the Crunchyroll version to know what that looks like?
I have no idea. I imagine the Crunchyroll version is pretty normal because I don't think they upload stuff at like interlaced and all of that. But I have not compared it.
Yeah, because the Crunchyroll version does not have the OVA, so even if people watch it there, you'll have to look up the OVA through other means. But yeah, so that's what we'll be covering next time. One other note I want just to set people up for Lucky Star, because I think it's good to know this going in, is that it is like universally regarded that the first 4 episodes of Lucky Star are the worst episodes. The show has an incredibly slow start. It's a slow show. It's a comedy show. It has a particularly slow start. These are the 4 episodes directed by the asshole Yamamoto Yutaka. I have already done all of my notes on that section of his background and what happened to him, so I'm like particularly aware of how much of a piece of shit that dude is. And he got booted from KyoAni after 4 episodes, and they switched over to Takemoto Yasuhiro, who finished out the show from episodes 5 all the way to the end for 24. So if you're watching the show and you're not totally vibing with the first 4 episodes, just know that is a very normal experience, and that, in my opinion, the show gets substantially better once Takemoto is running the show, and he's just much better at managing that big level. You know, Yamamoto, very good at directing an individual episode. You know, he did episode 0 here. He did Live Alive. Those are great episodes of anime. He's a piece of shit, and pieces of shit are not good at managing people. And managing people is what you have to do if you're directing a full show and a full production. And so episodes 1 through 4 suffer for that reason. And the show gets a lot better from there. So that's my little warning at the top of that. But that also means people can get ready for what will be the most exciting notes section for any Japanimation station we have done so far. I have gone through, and I've cherry-picked a couple of statements and tweets that Yamamoto Yutaka has made that is the stupidest fucking bullshit you've ever heard anyone say about anime in the history of the world. So get ready to hear some of that shit along with watching Lucky Star next week on Japanimation Station's Kyoto Vacation.